Carl Jung explained, "One small choice that heals your deepest wounds." In the beginning, there is always the wound. It arrives uninvited, often in childhood when the psyche is still soft clay, unformed and vulnerable to the impressions that will shape it for decades to come. Perhaps it was a parent's absent love, a betrayal by someone trusted, the shattering of innocence through violence or neglect. The wound carves itself into the tender flesh of being, leaving marks that seem to spell out our unworthiness, our fundamental flawed nature, our exile from the garden of belonging. But what if I told you that this wound, this source of your deepest anguish, this thing you have spent a lifetime trying to heal, hide, or transcend, is actually the most sacred doorway your soul possesses? What if the very thing you curse as your greatest misfortune is, in truth, the hidden key to your transformation? This is not the cruel optimism that seeks to minimize suffering by wrapping it in false silver linings. This is something far more profound, the recognition that the psyche, in its deepest wisdom, orchestrates experiences that serve the soul's ultimate purpose, individuation, the becoming of who we truly are beneath all the masks and defenses we have learned to wear. Carl Jung understood this with a clarity that pierced through centuries of religious and psychological misconceptions about suffering. He saw that the wound is not an interruption of our spiritual journey, it is the journey itself. The cracking open that seems to threaten our very survival is actually the breaking of the shell that has kept our truest self imprisoned. Consider the mythology of the wounded healer, found in cultures across the world and throughout time. Chiron, the centaur who could heal all wounds but his own, became the greatest teacher of healing arts precisely because of his incurable pain. The Celtic god Nuada, who lost his arm in battle and gained wisdom that could only come through loss. The shamanic traditions where the future healer must first be torn apart by spirits, dismembered psychically, before being reconstructed with new powers of perception and healing. These are not mere stories, they are maps of the soul's territory, showing us that wounding and healing are not opposites, but intimate partners in the dance of becoming whole. The wound serves a purpose that the ego, in its desperate desire for comfort and control, cannot understand. It creates what Jung called a divine discontent, and restlessness that prevents us from settling into unconscious patterns, a sacred irritation that keeps calling us toward growth. Like a grain of sand in an oyster that eventually becomes a pearl, the wound maintains a constant pressure that forces the psyche to develop new capacities for resilience, compassion, and wisdom. But here lies the crucial distinction that most people miss. Not all suffering leads to transformation. There is a difference between being wounded and being consecrated by one's wounds. The difference lies in consciousness, in the soul's willingness to turn toward the pain rather than away from it, to ask not, "Why me?" but, "What is this trying to teach me?" The unconscious psyche handles wounds in predictable ways. It builds defenses, walls of protection that also become walls of separation from life itself. It creates compensations, inflated aspects of personality that attempt to balance the deflated wound. It generates what Jung called complexes, autonomous fragments of psyche that operate like independent personalities, each carrying a piece of the original trauma and acting it out repeatedly in our relationships and life patterns. These unconscious responses are not failures of character or willpower. They are the psyche's natural protective mechanisms, as automatic as a hand pulling away from fire. But what serves us in surviving the initial wounding often becomes the very thing that keeps us trapped in its repetition. The defense becomes the prison. The compensation becomes the obsession. The complex becomes the recurring nightmare that plays out in relationship after relationship, job after job, crisis after crisis. This is why Jung emphasized that healing cannot happen through the elimination of symptoms or the resolution of complexes. These approaches treat the wound as a problem to be solved rather than as a sacred threshold to be crossed. True healing, what Jung called the transcendent function, requires something far more courageous: the willingness to descend into the wound itself and discover what treasures lie hidden in its depths. The descent into the wound is what mythologies call the journey to the underworld. It is Persephone's abduction by Hades that eventually makes her queen of both worlds. It is Inanna's voluntary descent through the seven gates, being stripped of all her regalia, dying and being reborn with the power to travel between realms. It is Christ's harrowing of hell that transforms death itself into a doorway to resurrection. In psychological terms, this descent is the ego's willingness to encounter the shadow, those aspects of self that have been buried, denied, or projected onto others because they were too painful or threatening to acknowledge. The wound often holds our most rejected parts: our vulnerability, our need, our rage, our shame. To heal, we must retrieve these lost pieces of soul, integrating them back into conscious awareness. But integration is not the same as indulgence. We do not heal by acting out our wounds unconsciously, by letting our pain become permission for hurting others or ourselves. The integration of shadow requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, feeling the full intensity of our pain while simultaneously cultivating the compassion and wisdom that can transform it. This is the alchemical process that the medieval mystics understood: the transformation of base metal into gold, of poison into medicine, of wound into wisdom. But this transformation cannot be forced or hurried. It requires what the alchemists called the patient work, the willingness to sit with the volatile mixture of conscious intention and unconscious content until something entirely new emerges. The wound becomes sacred when we recognize it as a doorway rather than a destination. Every time we feel that familiar ache, that old familiar territory of pain, we stand at a threshold. We can choose the well-worn path of unconscious reaction, blame, defense, numbing, withdrawal. Or we can choose the path less traveled, the descent into the wound with consciousness as our guide, curiosity as our torch, and compassion as our companion. The sacred nature of the wound lies not in the pain itself, but in its capacity to crack open our limited sense of self and reveal the vastness that lies beneath. Like a geode that appears to be simply a rough stone until it is broken open to reveal the crystals within, the wound splits apart the persona, the mask we show the world, and exposes the raw beauty of who we really are. This exposure is terrifying to the ego, which has invested enormous energy in maintaining its carefully constructed image. The wound threatens to reveal our neediness, our brokenness, our fundamental humanity in a world that seems to reward only strength and success. But what the ego experiences as threat, the self, Jung's term for the deeper transpersonal center of being, recognizes as liberation. The self knows that wholeness cannot be achieved by perfection, but only by the integration of all aspects of our experience, including and especially our wounds. It knows that compassion is not learned through happiness, but through suffering consciously held. It knows that wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the transformation of experience into understanding. The wound, when approached with consciousness, becomes a gateway to what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of psyche that connects us to all humanity. Our personal pain, when fully felt and consciously engaged, opens us to the universal experience of suffering and healing. We discover that our wound is not unique but archetypal, that we are part of a vast human story of breaking and mending, death and rebirth. This recognition dissolves the isolation that suffering creates. No longer are we alone in our pain. cut off from life and love by our brokenness. Instead, we become part of the ancient lineage of wounded healers, of those who have transformed their deepest pain into their greatest gift. We join the communion of souls who have discovered that the very thing that seemed to disqualify them from love actually makes them qualified to give it. The threshold nature of the wound means that it exists in the liminal space, neither fully of this world nor entirely beyond it. Liminality is the realm of transformation, the place where old forms dissolve and new ones are born. It is uncomfortable territory for the ego, which prefers the solid ground of the known and familiar, but it is the natural habitat of the soul, which lives for growth and change and the constant adventure of becoming. Standing at the threshold of the wound, we are invited into what Jung called active imagination, a way of engaging with unconscious content through conscious participation. We can dialogue with our wound, asking it what it needs, what it has to teach, what gifts it carries. We can explore its mythology, discovering what archetypal patterns it constellates in our lives. We can track its movement through our dreams, our relationships, our creative expressions. The wound as sacred threshold is not a concept to be understood intellectually, but a reality to be lived experientially. It requires what Jung called participation mystique, a way of knowing that engages the whole being rather than just the rational mind. It asks us to become intimate with our pain without being consumed by it, to approach our suffering with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a holy site. This approach transforms not only our relationship to our own wound, but our capacity to be present with others in their wounding. Having walked through the sacred threshold of our own pain, we develop what Jung called the wounded healer archetype within us. We become capable of sitting with others' suffering without needing to fix it, advise them out of it, or turn away from its intensity. The sacred threshold of the wound is where we learn the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and codependence. We discover that true healing presence does not require us to take on others' pain as our own, or to sacrifice our well-being for theirs. Instead, it asks us to maintain our own center while opening our hearts to the reality of universal suffering and the possibility of transformation. As we conclude this exploration of the wound as sacred threshold, we begin to understand that healing is not about becoming invulnerable, but about becoming vulnerable in a conscious way. It is not about eliminating pain, but about transforming our relationship to it. It is not about fixing what is broken, but about discovering the hidden wholeness that has been there all along, waiting beneath the surface like an underground spring that nourishes the roots of our becoming. The wound, approached as sacred threshold, becomes our greatest teacher, our deepest source of wisdom, our most reliable guide to authenticity. It strips away everything false and leads us home to who we have always been, beneath the layers of protection and pretense. In learning to love our wounds, we learn to love ourselves completely. In transforming our pain, we discover our purpose. In crossing the sacred threshold of our deepest suffering, we find the doorway to our truest life. The human psyche, in its magnificent complexity, operates much like a vast underground network of rivers and tributaries, most of which flow far beneath the surface of conscious awareness. What we experience as spontaneous emotional reactions, the sudden flare of rage at a perceived slight, the inexplicable wave of terror in response to intimacy, the compulsive need to control when faced with uncertainty. These are not random events, but the inevitable overflow of deeper currents that have been carved into the bedrock of our being through experiences we may not even remember. Jung understood that the wounded psyche, in its desperate attempt to avoid further injury, develops what he called autonomous complexes, semi-independent fragments of personality that operate according to their own logic, their own timeline, their own fierce devotion to survival. These complexes are like loyal soldiers who never receive the message that the war has ended, continuing to fight battles that may no longer be relevant to our current circumstances, but feel as urgent and life-threatening as they did in the original moment of wounding. Consider the woman who finds herself inexplicably attracted to unavailable men, partners who recreate the emotional landscape of her childhood, where love was always conditional, always just out of reach. Her conscious mind may desperately want a healthy relationship, may have read every book on attachment theory and attended therapy for years, yet something deeper than rational understanding continues to steer her toward the familiar territory of longing and disappointment. This is not masochism or poor judgment. This is the autonomous complex at work, carrying within it the wounded child's logic that love must be earned through suffering, that availability equals abandonment, that the familiar pain of wanting is safer than the unknown territory of receiving. The anatomy of unconscious reaction begins with what Jung called projection, the psyche's tendency to place onto external people and situations the unresolved conflicts that live within us. The wound acts like a movie projector, casting its internal drama onto the screen of current relationships and circumstances. The boss who triggers our rage may remind us unconsciously of the critical parent who never saw our worth. The friend whose success fills us with envy may activate the wounded part that believes there is not enough love or recognition to go around. The partner whose independence threatens us may constellate the terror of abandonment that was first inscribed in infancy. But projection is not simply a matter of mistaking others for figures from our past. It is far more subtle and pervasive than that. The wounded psyche actually seeks out and creates situations that confirm its deepest beliefs about reality. If we carry a core wound around unworthiness, we will unconsciously behave in ways that provoke rejection. If our fundamental injury is around powerlessness, we will find ourselves repeatedly in situations where we feel victimized. If our deepest fear is abandonment, we will push away those who come closest to us, ensuring that our terror becomes reality. This is what Freud called the repetition compulsion, but Jung understood it as something more than a mere psychological quirk. He saw it as the psyche's attempt to master the original trauma by recreating it under conditions where the outcome might be different. The wounded part of us keeps returning to the scene of the crime, hoping that this time we will be strong enough, wise enough, lovable enough to change the ending. The unconscious mind operates according to its own peculiar logic, one that makes perfect sense from the perspective of survival but often baffles the rational mind. It assumes that what was true in the past must be true now and forever. It believes that the world is fundamentally dangerous, that people are inherently untrustworthy, that we are essentially flawed and unlovable, not because these things are objectively true, but because they felt true in the formative moments when our psyche was learning how to navigate reality. The complex carries within it not only the original wound, but also the adaptations that helped us survive it. If we learned that expressing anger led to abandonment, the complex will contain both the suppressed rage and the compensatory niceness that kept us safe. If we discovered that showing vulnerability invited attack, the complex will hold both the denied tenderness and the defensive armor that protected it. If we found that being seen led to shame, the complex will encompass both the hidden parts of ourselves and the personas we developed to deflect attention. These compensatory behaviors often become so automatic, so deeply embedded in our way of being, that we mistake them for our true nature. The people-pleaser believes they are naturally generous and caring, not recognizing the fear-driven compulsion beneath their constant giving. The perfectionist assumes they simply have high standards, unable to see the terror of criticism that drives their relentless self-improvement. The controller thinks they are just naturally organized and responsible, blind to the chaos phobia that underlies their need to manage every detail of life. The shadow, Jung's term for the disowned aspects of personality, plays a crucial role in the anatomy of unconscious reaction. The qualities we cannot accept in ourselves get projected onto others with magnetic intensity. The person who has buried their own anger will be surrounded by angry people who seem to emerge from nowhere to trigger their carefully maintained peace. The individual who has denied their own neediness will attract clingy partners who activate their claustrophobia around emotional intimacy. The one who has rejected their own selfishness will find themselves constantly dealing with narcissistic colleagues and family members. This shadow projection serves a dual function for the wounded psyche. It allows us to disown the threatening aspects of ourselves while simultaneously giving us a target for the disowned emotions. We can feel righteous anger at the selfish person, never recognizing our own denied selfishness. We can feel superior to the needy individual, remaining unconscious of our own buried dependency. We can judge the angry person, staying disconnected from our own suppressed rage. But the shadow does not remain safely projected indefinitely. It has a way of breaking through our defenses at the most inconvenient moments, erupting in behaviors that seem utterly foreign to our self-image. The eternally patient person explodes in volcanic rage. The perpetually giving individual becomes suddenly and surprisingly selfish. The constantly responsible one acts out in reckless, destructive ways. These shadow eruptions are not character flaws or moral failings. They are the psyche's way of demanding integration, of insisting that we reclaim the split-off parts of ourselves. The wounded psyche also operates through what Jung called an entheodromia, the tendency for any extreme psychological position to flip into its opposite. The person who maintains perfect control for years may suddenly find themselves in the grip of complete chaos. The individual who never shows anger may become consumed with rage. The one who always puts others first may swing into extreme selfishness. These reversals are not random, but follow the natural law of psychological compensation, the psyche's attempt to restore balance by swinging the pendulum in the opposite direction. Understanding an entheodromia helps us recognize that our most cherished qualities, when held too rigidly, often become the very things that sabotage us. The strength that helped us survive childhood trauma can become the rigidity that prevents intimate connection. The independence that protected us from disappointment can become the isolation that starves us of love. The caution that kept us safe can become the paralysis that prevents us from truly living. The complex operates like a closed feedback loop, interpreting new experiences through the filter of old wounds and responding to current situations as if they were replicas of past traumas. It has its own internal consistency, its own logic, its own way of making sense of the world that feels absolutely true from the inside. Challenging a complex is like trying to convince someone who is dreaming that they are not really being chased by monsters. The experience feels utterly real, regardless of external evidence to the contrary. This is why rational approaches to healing often fall short. The wounded psyche is not operating from a rational place, but from a survival-based, emotionally driven, deeply embodied place that bypasses the thinking mind entirely. We cannot think our way out of unconscious reaction patterns any more than we can think our way out of quicksand. The harder we struggle with our logical minds, the deeper we tend to sink into the very patterns we are trying to escape. The physiology of unconscious reaction compounds this challenge. The wounded complex does not live only in the mind, but in the entire nervous system. encoded in muscle memory, respiratory patterns, hormonal responses, and autonomic reactions. When triggered, the body responds as if the original threat were happening right now, flooding us with stress hormones, activating fight-or-flight responses, and shutting down the prefrontal cortex where rational thinking occurs. In this activated state, we literally cannot access the parts of our brain that might offer alternative perspectives or creative solutions. We become temporarily possessed by the complex, as Jung might say, acting out behaviors and expressing emotions that feel foreign to our usual sense of self. The mild-mannered person becomes a raging tyrant. The confident professional becomes a terrified child. The independent adult becomes a clinging, desperate seeker of reassurance. The possession by the complex is not a sign of weakness or pathology, but a natural response to psychological activation, just as the body has automatic responses to physical threats. Pulling the hand away from fire, jumping back from a snake, the psyche has automatic responses to emotional threats. The problem arises when these responses, adaptive in the original context of wounding, become rigid patterns that limit our capacity to respond freshly to new situations. The wounded psyche also operates through what might be called emotional time travel, the unconscious tendency to collapse past, present, and future into a single moment of threat. The current disagreement with a partner becomes not just a present conflict, but a recreation of every abandonment we have ever experienced, and a preview of every rejection we imagine in the future. The momentary criticism from a boss triggers not only current professional anxiety, but every childhood experience of inadequacy and every future fear of failure. This temporal collapse is one reason why unconscious reactions feel so overwhelming and all-consuming. We are not just responding to what is actually happening in the present moment, but to the accumulated weight of every similar experience we have ever had, plus our projections about what might happen based on our wounded expectations about how life works. The complex also operates through what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious identification between self and other that occurs when we are in the grip of projection. In these moments, we literally cannot tell where we end and the other person begins. Their emotions become our emotions. Their behavior becomes proof of our worst fears about ourselves. Their reactions become confirmation of our deepest beliefs about how relationships work. This identification explains why we can become so intensely reactive to certain people and situations, while remaining relatively calm in the face of other, seemingly more significant challenges. The triggers that activate our complexes feel like direct threats to our survival because, psychologically speaking, they are. They threaten the carefully constructed defenses that have protected us from experiencing the full intensity of our original wounds. Breaking free from the anatomy of unconscious reaction requires first recognizing it in operation. This recognition often begins with the uncomfortable realization that we are not as conscious and in control as we imagined ourselves to be. We begin to notice the patterns, how we consistently attract certain types of difficult relationships, how we repeatedly find ourselves in similar conflicts, how we seem to sabotage ourselves just as success becomes possible. This recognition can be deeply humbling and initially disturbing to the ego, which prefers to maintain its illusion of mastery and control. But it also marks the beginning of genuine psychological freedom. Once we can see the patterns, once we can recognize the complex in action, we create the possibility of choice. We begin to understand that our reactions are not inevitable responses to objective reality, but automatic replications of old, unconscious programs that can be updated, integrated, and transformed. The anatomy of unconscious reaction, when fully understood, reveals itself to be not a flaw in human design, but a testament to the psyche's remarkable capacity for survival and adaptation. These patterns developed for good reasons. They helped us navigate impossible situations, protected us from overwhelming experiences, and allowed us to maintain some sense of coherence in the face of trauma. The problem is not that we have these patterns, but that we remain unconscious of them, allowing them to operate our lives from behind the scenes, like puppet masters pulling invisible strings. Understanding this anatomy is the first step toward freedom, not freedom from being human, not freedom from having reactions, but freedom to choose our responses rather than being compulsively driven by forces we do not understand. It is the beginning of the journey from unconscious reaction to conscious response, from being lived by our complexes to living from our deepest wisdom and authentic choice. There is a moment in every human life, sometimes many moments, when the veil of unconscious reaction suddenly parts, and we glimpse something that changes everything. It is not a moment of great enlightenment or mystical revelation, though it may feel that way in retrospect. It is something far more ordinary and yet infinitely more profound. The simple recognition that we have been participating in our own suffering. This is not the brutal self-attack that masquerades as insight, not the cruel voice that whispers we are to blame for everything that has befallen us. This is something entirely different, a clear-eyed seeing that emerges from the depths of compassion rather than the shallows of self-condemnation. It is the recognition that somewhere along the way, in our desperate attempts to protect ourselves from further wounding, we became complicit in recreating the very conditions we most feared. Jung understood this moment as the birth of consciousness itself, not the everyday awareness that allows us to navigate traffic and balance checkbooks, but the deeper consciousness that recognizes the difference between what is actually happening and what we unconsciously project onto what is happening. It is the dawning realization that between the stimulus of life's events and our response to them lies a space, a sacred pause, where choice lives. Consider the woman who has spent 30 years unconsciously choosing partners who cannot fully commit, then discovered herself once again in tears over another unavailable man. In the past, she might have raged at him for his emotional cowardice, blamed her friends for not warning her, cursed fate for dealing her such a cruel hand. But something different happens this time. Instead of immediately externalizing her pain, she finds herself asking a question that cuts to the bone. How did I choose this again? The question arises not from self-blame, but from genuine curiosity, the kind of wonder that emerges when we realize we have been sleepwalking through our own life and have suddenly awakened to find ourselves in a familiar but unwanted destination. There is shock in this recognition, yes, but also relief. Because if we have been unconsciously choosing our suffering, then perhaps we can consciously choose something different. This is the paradox that the wounded psyche must eventually face. The very thing that feels like it is happening to us is actually something we are unconsciously creating. The critical boss who makes us feel small is somehow familiar, somehow chosen from among other potential employers who might have seen our worth. The friend who betrays us carries an uncanny resemblance to the parent who first taught us that trust is dangerous. The pattern of financial scarcity that follows us from job to job bears the unmistakable signature of old beliefs about our unworthiness to receive abundance. The recognition of our participation in these patterns is simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it shatters the ego's carefully constructed narrative in which we are the innocent victims of life's random cruelties. Liberating because it reveals that we possess far more power than we realized. If we can unconsciously create suffering, we can consciously create healing. But this power is not the ego's power of force and control. It is something far more subtle and profound, the power of conscious choice in each moment. Jung called this the activation of the transcendent function, that miraculous capacity of the human psyche to hold the tension between opposing forces until something entirely new emerges. The moment of recognition often arrives through what might be called the final straw, not necessarily the worst thing that has ever happened to us, but the thing that happens when we can no longer maintain our unconscious patterns without seeing them clearly. It is the relationship that ends in exactly the same way as all the others, the job that becomes intolerable in precisely the same manner as its predecessors, the crisis that reveals itself to be wearing the face of every other crisis we have ever faced. In these moments, the psyche's protective mechanisms, denial, projection, rationalization, momentarily fail, and we see our patterns with startling clarity. We recognize the way we unconsciously telegraph our wounds to those who will inevitably wound us. We see how our defenses have become invitations to the very experiences we most want to avoid. We understand that what we call bad luck is actually the unconscious mind's remarkable consistency in manifesting our deepest beliefs about ourselves and the world. This seeing is not comfortable. The ego, confronted with evidence of its own unconscious participation in creating suffering, often responds with what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of depression, confusion, and existential questioning that marks the death of old illusions about how life works. The familiar landmarks of blame and victimhood are stripped away, leaving us temporarily disoriented in a landscape where we must take responsibility not for what has been done to us, but for what we do with what has been done to us. Yet within this discomfort lies the seed of transformation, because once we recognize our unconscious participation, we simultaneously recognize our conscious power to participate differently. The same psychological mechanisms that created our suffering can be enlisted in service of our healing. The same unconscious patterns that led us into difficulty can be made conscious and redirected toward growth. This is where Jung's understanding diverges from simpler self-help philosophies that suggest we can simply think positively or manifest our way to happiness. The recognition of choice is not a magic wand that instantly transforms our circumstances. It is more like acquiring a new sense. Suddenly we can perceive dimensions of experience that were previously invisible to us. We begin to notice the subtle ways we position ourselves in relationships to recreate familiar dynamics. We catch ourselves in the act of interpreting neutral events through the filter of old wounds. We recognize the moment when we are about to make a decision based on fear rather than wisdom. We see how our body language, our tone of voice, our choice of words unconsciously signal to others how we expect to be treated. The woman who keeps choosing unavailable partners begins to notice her unconscious attraction to the slight emotional distance that feels like home. Her tendency to interpret unavailability as a challenge rather than information. Her way of overlooking clear signals about a partner's capacity for commitment. She starts to see how her own fear of intimacy masquerades as a preference for independent men, how her terror of abandonment actually drives her to choose people who are guaranteed to leave. This seeing is not about self-attack, but about self-knowledge in the deepest sense. It is recognizing that we are far more complex beings than we imagined, that our psyche contains multitudes of conflicting desires and fears, many of which operate outside our conscious awareness. We discover that part of us genuinely wants love while another part is terrified of it, that one aspect of ourselves longs for success while another sabotages every opportunity for fear of visibility. Jung understood these internal contradictions not as flaws to be eliminated, but as the raw material of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are beneath all our defenses and compensations. The recognition of our participation in our own suffering is actually the recognition of our profound psychological complexity, our capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously, our ability to choose which aspects of ourselves we will express and develop. The birth of consciousness is also the birth of genuine compassion, not the syrupy sweetness that denies the reality of human darkness, but the fierce tenderness that can hold all of our contradictions with loving awareness. When we truly recognize our own unconscious participation in creating suffering, we simultaneously recognize everyone else's unconscious participation in theirs. We see that we are all walking wounded, all doing our best to navigate impossible circumstances with psychological equipment that was often damaged in childhood. This compassion does not excuse harmful behavior, our own or others, but it places it in a larger context of understanding. We begin to see that most cruelty emerges from unconscious pain, that most betrayal stems from unhealed wounds, that most destructive behavior is actually a desperate attempt to avoid feeling something too overwhelming to bear. The moment of recognition also marks the beginning of what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with unconscious contents. Instead of being lived by our complexes, we begin to dialogue with them. We start to ask our patterns what they are trying to protect, what they need, what they have to teach us. We develop curiosity about our symptoms rather than simply wanting them to disappear. The woman who chooses unavailable partners might begin to have conversations with the part of her that makes these choices, asking it what it fears would happen if she chose someone who was truly available. She might discover that this part equates availability with engulfment, commitment with the loss of self, intimacy with the obliteration of her carefully guarded independence. Understanding the wisdom within her pattern, the way it has protected her from genuine vulnerability, allows her to honor its positive intention while consciously choosing to take the risk of true intimacy. This is not about eliminating our patterns, but about bringing them into conscious relationship. The goal is not to become perfect beings who never react unconsciously, but to become aware beings who can recognize when we are in the grip of unconscious forces and choose how we want to respond. The recognition of choice is simultaneously humble and empowering. Humble because it reveals how much of our lives we have been living unconsciously. How many of our cherished beliefs about ourselves and others are actually projections and defenses. Empowering because it reveals that consciousness itself is a choice, that awareness is something we can cultivate, that wisdom is available in every moment if we are willing to pause and ask deeper questions. This recognition often comes in waves rather than as a single dramatic revelation. We might see clearly for a moment, then slip back into unconsciousness, then see again more deeply than before. Each wave of recognition builds upon the previous ones, gradually shifting the center of gravity in our psyche from unconscious reaction to conscious response. The process is not linear but spiral. We return to the same issues again and again, but each time from a slightly different vantage point, with a slightly deeper understanding, with a slightly greater capacity for choice. What felt like failure, the fact that we keep encountering the same challenges, reveals itself to be the psyche's wisdom, giving us repeated opportunities to practice new responses until they become natural. The moment of recognition awakening to choice is not a destination but a doorway, the entrance to a way of living that is more conscious, more intentional, more aligned with our deepest values and authentic nature. It marks the beginning of taking responsibility not for everything that happens to us, but for how we choose to respond to what happens to us. It is the birth of psychological freedom in the truest sense. Not freedom from life's difficulties, but freedom to meet those difficulties with wisdom, compassion, and choice. As this recognition deepens and stabilizes, we begin to understand that consciousness itself is not an achievement to be attained, but a practice to be lived, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath. We discover that the space between stimulus and response is not just a psychological concept, but a lived reality, a sacred pause where transformation becomes possible and healing begins. In the crucible of psychological transformation, there exists one choice that appears so simple it is easily dismissed, yet so profound it can alter the entire trajectory of a human life. It is not the grand gesture, not the dramatic decision to leave everything behind and start anew, not the heroic resolution to never again succumb to old patterns. It is something far more modest and infinitely more powerful. The choice to pause. This pause, this seemingly insignificant moment of hesitation between feeling triggered and acting from that trigger, is where the entire miracle of conscious healing lives. Jung understood this pause as the sacred space where the transcendent function operates, that mysterious bridge between the known and unknown, between the conscious and unconscious, between who we have been and who we might become. Consider what happens in the moment of activation. The familiar trigger appears, perhaps a tone of voice that carries the echo of childhood criticism, a gesture that resurrects old feelings of abandonment, a situation that constellation our deepest fears about our inadequacy or unworthiness. In that instant, the nervous system floods with the chemistry of the original wound. The body contracts with remembered pain. The mind races with familiar thoughts of defense or attack. Every fiber of our being screams for immediate action, to flee, to fight, to numb, to blame, to do anything to escape the unbearable intensity of feeling fully human. This is the moment where most healing attempts fail, not because people lack willpower or insight, but because they try to change their reactions rather than learning to pause within them. They focus on having different feelings rather than developing a different relationship to whatever feelings arise. They attempt to think their way out of emotional activation rather than learning to breathe their way through it. But the pause is not about stopping the reaction. It is about creating space within the reaction, learning to hold the fire of our activation without being consumed by it. It is the difference between being the emotion and feeling the emotion, between being possessed by the complex and witnessing the complex in action. When we first attempt this pause, it may last only a split second, just long enough to take a single conscious breath before the familiar pattern reasserts itself. But even this micro-pause is revolutionary. In that fraction of a moment, we taste what Jung called the freedom of consciousness, the recognition that we are not identical with our reactions, that there exists within us a witnessing presence that can observe even our most intense psychological weather without being swept away by it. The pause is not empty space, but pregnant silence, alive with possibility. It is like the moment between the lightning and the thunder, when the whole atmosphere vibrates with potential energy. In this space, something can emerge that has never existed before, a response that is neither reactive nor suppressed, but truly creative. This is where the ancient alchemists found their gold, not in the elimination of base materials, but in their conscious transformation. The anger remains anger, but it is no longer unconscious rage acting itself out in destruction. It becomes conscious fire that can fuel appropriate boundary setting or passionate advocacy for justice. The fear remains fear, but it is no longer panic driving us into paralysis or reckless action. It becomes conscious caution that can guide us toward wise discernment and appropriate self-protection. Learning to pause in the fire of activation requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. We must simultaneously feel the full intensity of our emotional response and maintain connection to the part of us that can witness and choose. This is perhaps the most challenging psychological skill a human being can develop, the capacity to be fully present to our pain without being overwhelmed by it, to feel our fear without being paralyzed by it, to acknowledge our anger without being controlled by it. The physiology of the pause is as important as its psychology. When we are triggered, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, floods the nervous system with stress hormones and shuts down access to the prefrontal cortex, where rational thinking and creative problem-solving occur. The pause allows us to consciously regulate this autonomic response through what might be called embodied presence. This begins with the breath, not the forced, controlling breath of someone trying to calm down, but the conscious, accepting breath of someone willing to be present to whatever is arising. As we breathe with our activation rather than against it, we signal to our nervous system that we are safe enough to feel what we are feeling. The breath becomes an anchor, keeping us tethered to the present moment while the storms of old emotion move through us. The pause also involves what might be called compassionate curiosity, the willingness to become interested in our reaction rather than simply wanting it to go away. Instead of judging our trigger as evidence of our brokenness or lack of spiritual development, we begin to approach it as information about our inner landscape, a message from the unconscious that deserves our attention and understanding. In the pause, we might ask ourselves, what is this reaction trying to protect? What old wound is being activated? What does this part of me need right now? These questions shift us from being victims of our reactions to becoming curious investigators of our inner world. They engage what Jung called the observing ego, that aspect of consciousness that can witness our psychological processes without being completely identified with them. The pause is also where we encounter what Jung called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we have disowned or denied. Our reactions often contain valuable information about parts of ourselves we have rejected. The person who triggers our anger may be expressing something we have forbidden ourselves to express. The individual who activates our judgment may be displaying a quality we cannot accept in ourselves. The situation that provokes our fear may be calling us toward growth we have been avoiding. In the pause, we have the opportunity to reclaim these projected aspects of ourselves. Instead of making others responsible for our reactions, we can ask what they are reflecting back to us about our own unconscious contents. This is not about taking blame for others' behavior, but about taking responsibility for our internal responses to others' behavior. The woman who finds herself enraged by her partner's emotional unavailability might discover in the pause her own disowned need for space and independence. The man who is triggered by his colleague's apparent selfishness might recognize his own buried longing to prioritize his own needs. The parent who reacts strongly to their child's defiance might encounter their own suppressed rebelliousness and autonomy. This reclaiming of projections is not comfortable work. It requires what Jung called eating our shadow, consciously integrating the aspects of ourselves we have spent years avoiding. But this integration is essential for psychological wholeness and authentic relationship. Until we own our projections, we remain unconsciously reactive to others, constantly triggered by the mirror they provide of our own disowned contents. The pause also creates space for what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate new solutions that transcend the usual either-or thinking of the ego. In our habitual reactions, we typically have only two choices: fight or flight, attack or withdraw, blame or shame. But in the pause, a third option can emerge, something that honors both our authentic needs and the complexity of the situation we are facing. This transcendent function does not operate through rational analysis, but through what might be called embodied intuition, a way of knowing that emerges from our whole being, rather than just our thinking mind. In the pause, we create space for this deeper wisdom to surface, for solutions to arise that neither pure emotion nor pure logic could generate alone. The practice of pausing is not about achieving a particular outcome or feeling a certain way. It is about developing what Jung called the capacity to suffer, and not in the sense of masochistic endurance, but in the original meaning of the word suffer, which means to allow or to undergo. It is the willingness to let our experience be what it is without immediately trying to change it, fix it, or escape from it. This allowing is perhaps the most radical act possible in a culture that is addicted to immediate relief from discomfort. The pause asks us to stay present to our pain, to remain curious about our triggers, to treat our reactions as sacred messengers rather than inconvenient interruptions to our preferred emotional state. As we develop the capacity to pause, we begin to notice that our triggers are not random, but follow recognizable patterns. Certain themes appear repeatedly: abandonment, criticism, control, betrayal, invisibility. These themes point toward our core wounds, the fundamental injuries around which our personality has organized itself. The pause allows us to become intimate with these patterns without being consumed by them. The pause is also where we encounter what Jung called the archetypal level of experience, those universal patterns that transcend our personal history and connect us to the collective human journey. Our individual triggers, often constellation archetypal themes: the abandoned child, the rejected lover, the unrecognized hero, the scapegoated truth-teller. In recognizing these larger patterns, our personal suffering is placed in a broader context that can provide meaning and even nobility to our struggles. The small choice to pause, practiced consistently over time, creates what might be called responsibility, the ability to respond rather than react. This is not about becoming emotionless or detached, but about developing the capacity to feel fully while maintaining access to choice. We learn to let our emotions inform our responses, without letting them determine our responses. This transformation is not linear or predictable. There will be many times when we forget to pause, when we react from old patterns, when we feel like we are making no progress at all. But Jung understood that psychological development happens in spirals rather than straight lines. Each time we remember to pause, each moment of conscious choice builds upon all the previous moments, gradually shifting the center of gravity in our psyche toward consciousness and away from compulsion. The pause becomes not just a technique, but a way of being, a fundamental orientation toward life that honors both the intensity of human emotion and the possibility of conscious choice. It is the difference between being lived by our patterns and living from our deepest wisdom. It is the birthplace of psychological freedom and the foundation upon which all genuine healing is built. In learning to pause in the fire of our activation, we develop what the mystics called the witness consciousness, that aspect of our being that can observe all of our psychological weather without being identified with any of it. This witness is not detached or dissociated, but intimately present and completely accepting of whatever arises. It is from this place of witnessing presence that true healing and transformation become possible. The small choice to pause, repeated thousands of times throughout a lifetime, becomes the choice that makes all other choices possible. It is the doorway between unconscious reaction and conscious response, between being victims of our conditioning and becoming artists of our own becoming. There is a moment in every healing journey when time becomes elastic, when the linear progression of minutes and hours gives way to something far more profound, a return to the eternal present where all healing ultimately occurs. In the sacred pause you have cultivated, in that conscious interruption of the habitual patterns that have governed your life, something miraculous begins to stir. Not miraculous in the sense of supernatural intervention, but miraculous in the way that consciousness itself is miraculous, the way that awareness, when brought to bear upon our deepest wounds, possesses an inherent capacity to transform what has long remained frozen in the amber of unprocessed pain. Jung understood what the mystics have always known, that within each of us lives not just the adult self that navigates the complexities of daily existence, but entire populations of selves across time, the child we once were, the adolescent who struggled with identity, the young adult who faced the world's betrayals, and yes, especially that wounded child who sits at the core of so much of our unconscious reactivity. This inner child is not a metaphor, not a psychological construct that exists only in theory. This child is as real as your breath, as present as your heartbeat, as influential in your daily choices as the most compelling adult authority you have ever known. But here is what makes this child archetype so powerful and so problematic. It exists in a state of suspended animation, frozen at the precise moment when the original wound occurred. While your body grew, while your mind developed sophisticated strategies for navigating the world, while your persona learned to present itself in socially acceptable ways, this inner child remained exactly as it was in the moment when love was withdrawn, when safety was shattered, when the world revealed itself to be something other than the nurturing womb it was supposed to be. In the pause, that sacred space between stimulus and response that you have been cultivating, you create the conditions necessary for this child to finally be met, not with the familiar patterns of abandonment or suppression that characterized your adaptive responses to early trauma, but with something this child has been waiting for across decades of unconscious longing: presence. Pure, undiluted, non-judgmental presence. The meeting is rarely dramatic. More often it begins as a subtle shift in your internal atmosphere, a softening around the edges of your habitual defenses. You might notice a quality of sadness that seems too vast for any current circumstance, or a fear that appears disproportionate to the situation at hand. You might find yourself reacting to present-day events with an emotional intensity that surprises you, as if some part of you is responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened long ago. This is the inner child announcing itself, not through words, but through the body's wisdom, through the emotional truths that precede rational understanding. The child speaks in the language of sensation and feeling, in the currency of tears that arise without obvious cause, in the trembling that occurs when someone's tone of voice unconsciously echoes the disapproval that once felt like annihilation. In traditional therapeutic approaches, there is often an attempt to heal the inner child through dialogue, through visualization, exercises where the adult self rescues the child self from past circumstances. While these approaches can be valuable, Jung's deeper understanding reveals that true healing occurs not through such interventions, but through the simple act of conscious witnessing, of allowing this child to be exactly as it is, without immediately rushing to fix or change or rescue. This witnessing is itself a form of love, perhaps the purest form of love available to human consciousness. It is the love that says, "You do not need to be different for me to see you. You do not need to be healed for me to accept you. You do not need to justify your pain for me to honor it." This is the love that was missing in the original wounding, not romantic love, not parental approval, but the fundamental recognition of worth that every sentient being requires to develop a healthy relationship with its own existence. When you pause in the face of emotional reactivity and instead of immediately moving to action or defense, you turn toward the inner landscape with genuine curiosity, you are offering this child what trauma therapists now understand to be the essential ingredient in all healing: attunement. Attunement is not about having answers or providing solutions. Attunement is about becoming present to another's experience without needing that experience to be other than what it is. The child within you has been waiting not for rescue, but for this quality of attunement, for an adult consciousness that can be with its pain without being overwhelmed by it, that can witness its fear without being consumed by terror, that can hold space for its rage without being destroyed by anger. This is what the conscious pause provides, a container strong enough to hold what has been too intense for the child to bear alone, spacious enough to allow the full expression of what has been compressed into unconscious reactivity. As you learn to meet this inner child with presence rather than reactivity, something profound begins to occur in your nervous system. The neural pathways that were carved by early trauma, those superhighways of hypervigilance, those well-worn tracks of emotional shutdown, begin to be complemented by new pathways of safety and connection. The brain, in its remarkable plasticity, begins to literally rewire itself based on this new experience of being met with presence rather than abandonment. This is not positive thinking or affirmation work. This is the deep neurological healing that occurs when the nervous system finally receives what it needed but did not get during its formative development. The co-regulation that comes from being in relationship with a consciousness that remains stable and present even in the face of intense emotion. The inner child carries within its small frame not just the wounds of your personal history, but the archetypal wounds of all children who have faced the fundamental disappointment of discovering that the world is not always safe, that love is not always unconditional, that the adults who were supposed to provide security are themselves wounded and limited. In healing your inner child, you are participating in a healing that extends far beyond your personal psyche. You are helping to heal the collective wound of childhood trauma that runs like a deep river beneath the surface of human civilization. Jung recognized that the child archetype holds not just our wounds, but our potential. Within the inner child lives all the spontaneity, creativity, wonder, and authenticity that you possessed before the world taught you to hide these qualities behind the mask of social acceptability. As you learn to meet this child with presence, as you provide the attunement that was missing in the original circumstances, you begin to reclaim not just your capacity for emotional stability, but your access to these essential life forces that have been locked away behind the walls of adaptive defense. The child's wounds become doorways to its gifts. Its hypersensitivity, which may have made survival difficult in a harsh world, reveals itself as a profound capacity for empathy and emotional intelligence. Its rebelliousness, which may have been punished and suppressed, emerges as a healthy capacity to resist conformity when conformity would betray authentic values. Its fearfulness, when met with compassionate understanding, transforms into appropriate caution and wise discernment. This transformation does not happen through effort or technique, but through the simple practice of showing up, of interrupting your habitual patterns of emotional reactivity with the conscious choice to pause and meet whatever arises with presence. Each time you choose presence over reactivity, you are providing this inner child with a new experience of what it means to be in relationship with consciousness that does not abandon or attack when faced with difficult emotions. The healing that occurs in these moments of conscious meeting is not dramatic or sudden. It is subtle, cellular, foundational. It happens in the spaces between thoughts, in the softening that occurs when defenses relax, in the gentle regulation that emerges when the nervous system finally receives the co-regulation it has been seeking since birth. You begin to notice that your emotional reactions become less intense, not because you are suppressing them, but because the child within feels safe enough to express its needs directly rather than through the coded language of symptoms and reactivity. You find yourself able to tolerate uncertainty, not because uncertainty has become comfortable, but because the part of you that fears uncertainty no longer feels utterly alone with its fear. The relationship between your adult consciousness and your inner child becomes a model for all your relationships. As you learn to meet your own wounds with presence rather than judgment, you naturally develop the capacity to extend this same quality of presence to others. The compassion you offer your inner child becomes available to offer your partner, your children, your friends, even strangers whose behavior might otherwise trigger your reactive patterns. This is Jung's understanding of individuation at its most practical level, the process by which unconscious contents are brought into conscious relationship, not to be eliminated or transcended, but to be integrated into the wholeness of who you are. The inner child is not a problem to be solved, but an aspect of your psyche to be welcomed home, to be included in the council of selves that makes up your complete identity. In the ancient alchemical texts that Jung studied so deeply, there is a stage called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between opposing forces that results in the creation of something entirely new. The meeting between your adult consciousness and your inner child is such a sacred marriage, the union of maturity and innocence, wisdom and wonder, stability and spontaneity. From this union emerges what Jung called the self, not the ego with its limited perspective and defensive strategies, but the larger identity that encompasses both your wounds and your wholeness, both your historical conditioning and your essential nature. This self is not an achievement to be attained, but a recognition of what has always been true, that you are large enough to hold all the contradictions of your experience, spacious enough to encompass both the child who was wounded and the adult who has learned to choose healing. The pause that began as a simple interruption of reactive patterns reveals itself as a doorway to this larger identity. In the space of conscious presence, the inner child is not healed in the sense of being fixed or changed, but in the deeper sense of being included, welcomed, given the recognition and belonging it has always required. This healing ripples outward into every aspect of your life. Relationships that were once characterized by unconscious reenactment of childhood dynamics begin to be characterized by conscious choice and authentic connection. Work that may have been driven by unconscious attempts to prove worthiness or avoid abandonment begins to flow from a deeper sense of purpose and creative expression. Even your relationship to your own mistakes and imperfections transforms as you extend to yourself the same patience and compassion you have learned to offer your inner child. The child within, no longer exiled to the unconscious, where it could only express itself through symptoms and reactivity, becomes an active partner in your conscious living. Its wisdom, the wisdom of presence, authenticity, and emotional truth, informs your adult decisions. Its joy, the joy that exists independent of external circumstances, becomes available to color your daily experience. Its love, the unconditional love that existed before the world taught you that love must be earned, becomes the foundation from which you relate to yourself, others. This is the gift of the conscious pause, not the elimination of your wounded parts, but their integration into the wholeness of who you are. The inner child, met with presence rather than abandonment, becomes not a burden to be carried, but a source of vitality to be celebrated. In learning to be present to your own pain, you discover your capacity to be present to all of life's experience with the same quality of open-hearted awareness. The alchemy is simple and profound. Presence transforms everything it touches, not by changing it, but by allowing it to be seen clearly for the first time. In this seeing, this witnessing, this conscious meeting of what has long remained hidden in the shadows of unconscious reactivity, healing happens not as an event, but as a way of being, not as a destination to be reached, but as a quality of presence to be embodied moment by moment by moment. There is a teaching in the ancient alchemical traditions that Jung found particularly compelling. That which appears as poison in one context reveals itself as medicine in another. The same substance that can destroy when encountered unconsciously becomes the very agent of healing when approached with the proper preparation and understanding. This principle, which the alchemists called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, finds its most profound application in what Jung identified as perhaps the most challenging and transformative aspect of psychological work, the integration of the shadow. In the sacred pause you have been cultivating, in that conscious space between the triggering event and your automatic response, you create the conditions necessary to encounter what has long remained hidden in the basement of your psyche. The shadow is not simply the collection of your negative traits or moral failings. It is far more complex and far more valuable than such simplistic definitions suggest. The shadow contains everything that your ego, in its well-intentioned but limited attempt to construct a viable identity, deemed incompatible with survival, acceptance, and belonging. Within the shadow lies not just what is genuinely destructive, but what is simply too powerful, too authentic, too threatening to the carefully constructed persona that you learn to present to the world. Your anger may have been shadowed if expressing it led to abandonment. Your sensitivity may have been shadowed if it was met with ridicule or impatience. Your creative wildness may have been shadowed if it disrupted the family's need for order and predictability. Your intelligence may have been shadowed if it made others feel threatened or inadequate. The shadow, contrary to popular understanding, is not your enemy. It is the repository of your unlived life, the treasure house of potentials that were sacrificed on the altar of adaptation. Jung understood that every psychological adaptation, every strategy developed to navigate the complexities of early relationships and social belonging requires the suppression of certain aspects of the psyche. These suppressed aspects do not disappear. They migrate to the unconscious, where they continue to influence your life, but now from outside the reach of conscious choice and integration. In the pause, as you learn to interrupt the automatic patterns that have governed your reactivity, you begin to encounter the shadow not as an abstract concept, but as a living presence within your own psyche. This encounter rarely announces itself with dramatic fanfare. More often, it begins as a subtle recognition that your most intense emotional reactions to others often point to precisely those aspects of yourself that you have disowned. The colleague whose confidence triggers your harshest judgment may be reflecting back your own disowned power, the power you learned to suppress because early authority figures felt threatened by your natural assertiveness. The friend whose emotional expressiveness irritates you beyond proportion may be mirroring the passionate nature you buried beneath layers of rational control because your family could not tolerate the intensity of your feelings. The stranger whose apparent neediness evokes your contempt may be showing you the vulnerable dependency you have spent decades trying to prove you had transcended. Jung called this phenomenon projection, but his understanding went far deeper than the simple psychological mechanism of attributing your own traits to others. He recognized that projection serves the psyche's attempt to bring shadowed contents back into conscious relationship, even if initially this happens through the distorted lens of external attribution. The very people who trigger your most intense reactions are offering you, unconsciously, the opportunity to reclaim the disowned aspects of yourself. But here is where the conscious pause becomes essential. Without the space between stimulus and reaction, these encounters with projected shadow material simply perpetuate the cycle of unconscious reactivity. You attack in others what you cannot tolerate in yourself. You judge in external behavior what you have refused to acknowledge as your own potential. You create external conflicts that mirror the internal war between ego and shadow that rages beneath conscious awareness. In the pause, however, something entirely different becomes possible. Instead of immediately moving into judgment, defense, or attack, when confronted with behavior that triggers your reactivity, you can turn inward with curious attention. Not self-flagellation, not harsh self-examination, but gentle inquiry. What in this person's behavior is evoking such a strong response in me? What aspect of my own nature might I be encountering through this external mirror? This practice of shadow work is not about taking responsibility for other people's behavior or excusing genuinely harmful actions. It is about recognizing that the intensity of your emotional reaction often points to something within your own psyche that is seeking integration. The person whose behavior triggers you may indeed be acting inappropriately, but your particular emotional charge, the specific quality and intensity of your reaction, belongs to your own psychological material. As you learn to pause and turn toward rather than away from these triggered responses, you begin to discover what Jung meant when he spoke of the shadow as containing gold. The very qualities that you have spent energy suppressing or denying reveal themselves as essential aspects of your complete humanity, as sources of vitality and authenticity that have been locked away behind the walls of psychological defense. Your disowned anger, when consciously integrated, becomes your capacity for healthy boundaries, your ability to say no to what violates your values, your strength to stand up for yourself and others when situations demand moral courage, your suppressed vulnerability, when welcomed back into conscious relationship, transforms into your capacity for genuine intimacy, your ability to connect with others at levels deeper than surface pleasantries, your strength to ask for help when help is genuinely needed, your hidden grandiosity, when approached with compassionate understanding rather than shame, reveals itself as your natural confidence, your ability to take up appropriate space in the world, your willingness to share your gifts without false modesty. Your secret neediness, when met with acceptance rather than judgment, becomes your healthy capacity for interdependence, your recognition that human beings are designed for connection and mutual support. The transformation of shadow into strength is not accomplished through willpower or positive thinking, but through the simple practice of conscious relationship. Each time you pause in the face of reactivity and turn inward with compassionate curiosity, you are creating the conditions for what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the conscious effort to integrate what the unconscious would keep separate. This integration happens not through dramatic revelation, but through thousands of small moments of conscious choice. The moment you recognize your harsh judgment of another's confidence as pointing to your own disowned power and choose to explore rather than attack. The moment you notice your irritation with someone's emotional expressiveness as reflecting your own suppressed passion and choose curiosity over contempt. The moment you catch yourself projecting your own unlived potentials onto others and choose to reclaim rather than reject. With each such moment of conscious integration, the shadow begins to transform from adversary to ally. The energy that was previously bound up in repression becomes available for creative expression. The vitality that was locked away in unconscious complexes returns to conscious life. The aspects of yourself that were sacrificed for adaptation begin to inform your adult choices with their essential wisdom. Jung understood that this integration of opposites within the individual psyche had implications that extended far beyond personal healing. He recognized that the failure to integrate shadow material at the individual level contributed to the projection of collective shadows onto groups, nations, and ideologies, the psychological mechanism underlying racism, nationalism, and all forms of dehumanizing prejudice. When you learn to meet your own shadow with conscious presence rather than unconscious rejection, you develop the psychological capacity to recognize projection when it arises and choose conscious relationship over unconscious reactivity. This does not mean becoming passive in the face of genuine injustice or harmful behavior. It means developing the discernment to distinguish between your own psychological material and legitimate responses to external circumstances. The pause that began as a simple interruption of reactive patterns reveals itself as a doorway to psychological wholeness. In the space of conscious presence, the shadow is not eliminated or transcended, but welcomed back into the complete identity of who you are. This integration does not make you perfect. It makes you whole. It does not eliminate your capacity for destructive behavior. It brings that capacity into conscious relationship, where it can be transformed into constructive power. The person who has integrated significant shadow material becomes paradoxically both more gentle and more fierce than before. More gentle because they no longer need to defend against aspects of their own nature. More fierce because they have reclaimed the power that was locked away in unconscious complexes. They become capable of what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining awareness of their full human potential without being possessed by either their light or dark aspects. This integration manifests in practical ways. Relationships become more authentic as you stop projecting disowned aspects of yourself onto others and begin relating to them as they actually are, rather than as repositories for your unconscious material. Conflicts become opportunities for mutual understanding rather than battlegrounds for psychological projection. Creative expression becomes more vital as the energy locked in repression returns to conscious availability. The shadow's gifts extend beyond individual transformation into what Jung recognized as the essential work of our time. The development of psychological containers strong enough to hold the full spectrum of human experience without splitting into good and evil, us and them, light and dark. The person who has learned to hold their own contradictions with compassionate awareness becomes capable of holding space for others to explore their contradictions without judgment or attack. In the conscious pause, the shadow reveals its ultimate gift, not the elimination of your capacity for darkness, but the integration of that capacity into conscious choice. You become capable of fierceness when fierceness serves love, of anger when anger serves justice, of selfishness when self-care serves your capacity to give, of ruthlessness when ruthlessness serves protection of what is sacred. The poison transforms into medicine not by changing its essential nature, but by changing the consciousness through which it is approached. The same psychological force that could destroy when operating unconsciously becomes a source of healing when brought into conscious relationship. This is the fundamental teaching of shadow work, that wholeness comes not through perfection, but through integration, not through the elimination of darkness, but through the conscious relationship with all aspects of your human potential. The alchemical marriage between ego and shadow, facilitated by the simple practice of pausing before reacting, creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a new level of consciousness that transcends the previous opposition between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of the self. From this integrated consciousness, choices arise not from the limited perspective of the defended ego, but from the wholeness of your complete humanity, including both your capacity for creation and destruction, both your light and your darkness, both your strength and your vulnerability. This is the shadow's ultimate gift, the recognition that you are large enough to contain multitudes, complex enough to hold paradox, strong enough to integrate what seemed irreconcilable. In embracing your shadow, you reclaim your birthright as a complete human being, capable of the full spectrum of human experience and response, no longer divided against yourself but whole, integrated, and authentically alive. There exists within the human psyche a profound paradox that Jung spent decades exploring. The same experience that can destroy consciousness, when met unconsciously, can become the very foundation of transformation when encountered with awareness. This paradox lies at the heart of what he distinguished as the fundamental difference between neurotic suffering and conscious suffering, a distinction that reveals itself with particular clarity in the sacred space of the pause you have been cultivating. Neurotic suffering is the unconscious repetition of old wounds, the endless cycling through familiar patterns of pain without the awareness necessary to transform them. It is the suffering of the hamster wheel, the grinding repetition of psychological patterns that feel both compulsive and futile. This is the suffering of the victim identity that has become so familiar it feels like home. The suffering of the wound that has become an identity rather than an experience to be integrated. Conscious suffering, by contrast, is the deliberate choice to feel your pain fully while maintaining awareness of the one who suffers. It is the willingness to descend into the depths of your experience without losing your connection to the witnessing consciousness that observes the descent. This is suffering that serves transformation, pain that becomes compost for new growth, difficulty that reveals itself as the raw material from which wisdom is forged. The distinction between these two forms of suffering is not academic. It is the difference between remaining trapped in repetitive patterns and discovering the doorway to psychological freedom. In the pause, that conscious interruption between stimulus and automatic response, you create the conditions necessary for neurotic suffering to be transformed into conscious suffering, for pain to become purposeful rather than merely repetitive. The transformation begins with a subtle shift in your relationship to difficulty itself. Instead of immediately seeking escape when pain arises, instead of rushing toward distraction, numbing, or premature solutions, you learn to pause and turn toward the experience with what the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls precise awareness. This is not masochistic dwelling in pain for its own sake, but the recognition that within every experience of suffering lies information essential to your psychological development. Jung understood this principle through his deep study of alchemy, where the motto solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, described the essential process of transformation. The alchemists recognized that before any substance could be refined into its highest form, it first had to be broken down, dissolved, reduced to its component elements. Only then could it be reconstituted into something more pure, more valuable, more aligned with its essential nature. Conscious suffering follows this same alchemical principle. The pain that arises in your life, whether triggered by external events or emerging from the depths of unprocessed psychological material, must first be fully felt, fully experienced, fully dissolved into its component elements before it can be reconstituted as wisdom, compassion, or strength. This dissolution happens not through analysis or interpretation, but through the simple act of conscious feeling, of allowing the experience to be exactly what it is, without immediately rushing to change or fix or understand. In the pause, when you choose presence over reactivity, you are creating the sacred container necessary for this alchemical process. You are saying to your psyche, I am willing to be with this experience fully, to feel it completely, to let it teach me what it has come to teach. This willingness to be present to difficulty without immediately seeking escape activates what Jung called the psyche's natural healing intelligence, the inherent capacity for transformation that exists within consciousness itself. The process rarely feels comfortable. Conscious suffering asks you to feel what you have spent considerable energy avoiding. It requires you to sit with uncertainty when your conditioned mind craves immediate resolution. It demands that you remain present to pain when every instinct urges flight or fight or freeze. This is why conscious suffering requires such tremendous courage, not the courage of the warrior who conquers external enemies, but the courage of the mystic who is willing to descend into the depths of their own being without guarantee of what they will find there. Yet it is precisely this willingness to feel fully that activates the transformative power inherent in all human experience. When pain is met with presence rather than resistance, when difficulty is encountered with awareness rather than unconscious reactivity, something remarkable begins to occur. The experience begins to reveal its hidden dimensions, its deeper teachings, its potential for contributing to your psychological wholeness rather than merely disrupting your psychological comfort. The death of a loved one, when met with conscious suffering, becomes not just an experience of loss, but an initiation into the preciousness of love itself, a teaching about the temporary nature of all forms, a deepening of empathy for all beings who face separation and mortality. The betrayal by a trusted friend, when encountered with awareness rather than mere resentment, reveals the places where your own capacity for discernment needs strengthening, where your projections created unrealistic expectations, where your heart can develop greater wisdom about trust and boundaries. The failure of a cherished dream, when met with conscious presence rather than bitter disappointment, opens doorways to dreams you could not have imagined while attached to the original vision. The diagnosis of illness, when approached with awareness rather than mere terror, becomes a teacher about what truly matters, a guide to values that may have been obscured by the busyness of ordinary life, an invitation to depths of presence you might never have discovered in the comfort of perfect health. This is not positive thinking or spiritual bypassing, the premature attempt to transform pain into meaning before it has been fully felt. Conscious suffering requires first the complete experience of the pain itself, the full descent into the reality of loss, disappointment, fear, or grief. Only when the experience has been honored in its raw reality can its transformative potential be realized. Jung observed this process in his own psychological crisis, the period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Rather than seeking immediate relief from the disorienting experiences that arose during this dark night of the soul, he chose to engage with them directly, to record them, to dialogue with them, to let them teach him what they had come to teach. This conscious engagement with his own psychological suffering became the foundation for his revolutionary understanding of the psyche and his contribution to the healing of countless others. The same courage that Jung demonstrated in his personal crisis is available to you in the micro moments of daily life. Each time you pause when triggered, each time you choose presence over reactivity, each time you turn toward rather than away from what is difficult, you are engaging in the same essential work of transformation. You are choosing conscious suffering over neurotic suffering, purposeful pain over repetitive pain, alchemical dissolution over unconscious cycling. The practice is deceptively simple. When pain arises, instead of immediately seeking escape, you pause and ask, what is this experience trying to teach me? What am I being asked to feel? What am I being invited to understand about myself, about life, about the human condition? These questions are not asked from the mind's desire to immediately understand and control, but from the heart's willingness to be taught by experience itself. As you develop this capacity for conscious suffering, you begin to discover that Your relationship to difficulty undergoes a fundamental transformation. Pain does not disappear from your life, but it loses its quality of meaningless victimization. Challenges do not cease to arise, but they reveal themselves as opportunities for psychological and spiritual development. Losses continue to occur, but they become initiations into deeper levels of love and appreciation rather than simply sources of diminishment. This transformation ripples outward into your relationships with others who are suffering. Having learned to be present to your own pain without immediately rushing to fix or escape, you develop the capacity to be genuinely present to others in their difficulty without the compulsive need to rescue, advise, or minimize their experience. Your presence becomes a gift that allows others to feel their own pain fully, to discover their own capacity for conscious suffering, to find their own pathway through difficulty toward transformation. The alchemy of conscious suffering reveals that the psyche possesses an innate intelligence that knows how to transform experience into wisdom, pain into compassion, difficulty into strength. This intelligence cannot be accessed through willpower or positive thinking. It emerges naturally when consciousness is brought to bear upon experience with patience, presence, and genuine willingness to be taught. Jung's revolutionary insight was that this transformative capacity exists within every human being, not as a special gift reserved for the few, but as the natural birthright of consciousness itself. The same awareness that can observe pain can also be transformed by it when the relationship between observer and observed is approached with the proper attitude, not the attitude of conquest or control, but the attitude of apprenticeship to experience itself. In the space of the conscious pause, neurotic suffering begins its transformation into conscious suffering through the simple act of remaining present to what is arising rather than immediately seeking escape. This presence does not eliminate pain but changes your relationship to it, transforming it from meaningless repetition into purposeful experience, from psychological imprisonment into spiritual education. The dissolution that occurs in conscious suffering, the breaking down of old patterns, assumptions, and identities that happens when we truly feel our pain, creates space for something new to emerge. This is the coagulation phase of the alchemical process, the reconstitution of consciousness at a higher level of integration, the emergence of wisdom that could only be forged in the fires of consciously experienced difficulty. Through this process, you discover that you are larger than any single experience of pain, more resilient than you imagined, more capable of transformation than your conditioned mind believed possible. The suffering that once seemed like evidence of your limitation reveals itself as proof of your capacity for consciousness, your ability to be present to the full spectrum of human experience without being destroyed by it. This is the ultimate gift of conscious suffering, the recognition that consciousness itself is strong enough to hold whatever arises, spacious enough to encompass both joy and sorrow, wise enough to find meaning and purpose even in the most difficult experiences. In learning to suffer consciously, you discover not just your capacity to endure, but your ability to transform whatever life presents into the raw material of awakening, growth, and service to the healing of the world. In the deepest chambers of psychological transformation, beyond the initial recognition of the wounded child, beyond the integration of shadow material, beyond the conscious engagement with suffering itself, there awaits what Jung considered the ultimate achievement of human consciousness, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without the compulsive need for resolution. This is the sacred marriage of contradictions, the union of what the rational mind insists cannot coexist, the integration that reveals itself not as compromise, but as a transcendence into a larger order of being. The pause that began as a simple interruption of reactive patterns has brought you to this threshold where the very nature of identity itself undergoes a fundamental transformation. No longer bound by the either-or thinking that characterizes ordinary consciousness, no longer compelled to choose between wounded and healed, strong and vulnerable, light and dark, you discover your capacity to embody what Jung called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites that marks the birth of psychological wholeness. This integration does not emerge through effort or technique, but through the natural culmination of all the work you have been doing in the sacred space of conscious pause. Each time you have chosen presence over reactivity, each time you have met your inner child with compassion rather than abandonment, each time you have welcomed shadow material back into conscious relationship, each time you have transformed neurotic suffering into conscious suffering, you have been preparing the psychic ground for this ultimate flowering of consciousness. Jung observed this process most clearly in his study of the alchemical texts, where the opus magnus, the great work, culminated not in the creation of literal gold, but in what the alchemists called the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum that possessed the miraculous capacity to transform base metals into precious ones. Jung recognized that this stone was a symbol for the integrated personality, the consciousness that has learned to transform whatever it encounters through the alchemy of conscious relationship. The integrated consciousness does not eliminate contradictions, but learns to hold them in such a way that they become sources of creative energy rather than psychological conflict. You discover that you can be simultaneously wounded and healed. Wounded in the sense that your early experiences of pain remain part of your history, healed in the sense that these experiences now inform your capacity for compassion, rather than driving unconscious reactivity. The wound becomes a sacred opening through which love enters the world, not despite the pain, but because of your conscious relationship with it. This is far different from the premature healing that attempts to transcend pain before it has been fully integrated. The consciousness that has learned to hold opposites knows itself to be both victim and victor simultaneously. Victim in the sense that certain experiences were genuinely beyond your control and caused legitimate harm. Victor in the sense that you have reclaimed your power to choose how these experiences inform your present moment responses. The victimization becomes sacred testimony to resilience rather than evidence of permanent damage. In the space of integrated consciousness, you discover your capacity to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable. Your strength no longer depends on the denial of vulnerability, but emerges from your willingness to remain open-hearted even in the face of potential hurt. Your vulnerability no longer feels like weakness, but reveals itself as the very quality that allows genuine intimacy and authentic connection. The armor that once protected you is no longer needed because you have discovered that your essential nature is both more resilient and more tender than you had imagined. Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological attitudes to transform into their opposites when taken to extremes, reveals itself not as a problem to be solved, but as the natural rhythm of psychological life that can be danced with rather than fought against. You learn to recognize when your strength has become rigidity that needs the softening influence of vulnerability, when your compassion has become enabling that needs the firmness of healthy boundaries, when your independence has become isolation that needs the nourishment of interdependence. Rather than being destabilized by these natural fluctuations between opposites, the integrated consciousness learns to surf them with the skill of a master sailor who uses both favorable and contrary winds to reach the desired destination. You become capable of what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining awareness of contradictory impulses, feelings, and potentials without immediately collapsing into one pole or the other. This capacity for holding tension transforms every aspect of your life. In relationships, you no longer need your partner to be perfectly consistent in order to love them fully. You can love their kindness without being destroyed by their occasional selfishness, appreciate their strength without being diminished by their moments of weakness, cherish their presence without being devastated by their need for space. The relationship itself becomes a container for the full spectrum of human experience rather than a refuge from it. In your work and creative expression, you discover the capacity to be simultaneously confident and humble, confident in your unique gifts and perspectives, humble in recognition of how much you still have to learn. Your creativity no longer depends on the absence of doubt, but learns to dance with uncertainty as a creative partner. Your professional relationships become opportunities for mutual development rather than competitions for scarce resources of approval or success. Most profoundly, your relationship with yourself undergoes a complete transformation. The internal critic that once seemed like an enemy reveals itself as an aspect of your psyche that, when integrated rather than battled, contributes to your capacity for excellence and growth. The inner child that once felt like a burden becomes a source of spontaneity and joy that informs your adult decisions. The shadow aspects that once generated shame become sources of power and authenticity that enrich your self-expression. This integration is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process that continues to deepen throughout your life. Each new challenge, each unexpected loss, each moment of joy or sorrow becomes an opportunity to practice this capacity for holding opposites in creative tension. You discover that growth happens not through the resolution of contradictions, but through your increasing ability to remain conscious and responsive, while embracing the full complexity of any situation. Jung understood that this individual work of integration had implications that extended far beyond personal healing. He recognized that the person who has learned to hold opposites within themselves becomes capable of holding space for others to explore their own contradictions without judgment or premature advice. They become living demonstrations that human beings are large enough to contain multitudes, complex enough to transcend simple categorizations, resilient enough to embrace the full spectrum of experience without being destroyed by any particular aspect of it. The integrated consciousness begins to see the same capacity for holding opposites reflected in the larger patterns of life itself. Nature is simultaneously creative and destructive, nurturing and challenging, beautiful and terrible. The seasons cycle between growth and decay, expansion and contraction, activity and rest. The cosmos itself dances between forces of expansion and contraction, creation and dissolution, order and chaos. Rather than feeling alienated by these larger contradictions, the integrated personality recognizes them as the fundamental creative principles that make life possible. You begin to trust the intelligence that orchestrates these apparent oppositions, to sense your place within the larger web of relationships that includes both harmony and conflict, both cooperation and competition, both love and loss. This trust does not make you passive, but allows your actions to arise from a deeper place of wisdom that can respond appropriately to whatever circumstances require. Sometimes life calls for fierce protection, sometimes for gentle yielding. Sometimes the situation demands clear boundaries, sometimes radical openness. Sometimes the moment asks for solitary reflection, sometimes for engaged participation. The integrated consciousness develops the sensitivity to discern what each situation truly requires, rather than responding from habitual patterns or rigid ideological positions. In the pause that has become second nature, you find yourself capable of accessing this discriminating wisdom moment by moment. The space between stimulus and response has expanded into a vast inner landscape where you can consult not just your immediate emotional reactions, but the deeper intelligence that emerges from the integration of all your psychological contents. Your responses begin to arise from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from integration rather than internal conflict. Jung called this integrated consciousness the self, not the ego with its limited perspective and defensive strategies, but the larger identity that encompasses both conscious and unconscious contents, both personal and collective dimensions, both individual and universal aspects of human experience. The self is not an achievement to be attained, but a recognition of what has always been true, that you are much larger than any single aspect of your personality, much more resilient than your wounds, much more creative than your limitations. From this perspective of the integrated self, the pause that began as a simple interruption of reactive patterns reveals itself as a doorway to a completely different way of being human. You are no longer driven by the compulsive need to choose between contradictory aspects of yourself, but can embody them all in conscious relationship. You are no longer destabilized by the contradictions you encounter in others, but can meet them with the same spacious awareness you have learned to bring to your own internal complexity. This is the ultimate gift of the healing choice, not the elimination of contradiction, but the capacity to dance with paradox, not the resolution of opposites, but the ability to hold them in creative tension, not the achievement of perfection, but the embodiment of wholeness that includes both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability, both woundedness and healing. The alchemy is complete not when the base metal of ordinary consciousness is transformed into the gold of spiritual transcendence, but when you discover that consciousness itself is the philosopher's stone, capable of transforming whatever it touches through the simple act of conscious relationship. In learning to embrace opposites rather than resolve them, you become a living demonstration of the vast capacity of human awareness to hold, integrate, and be transformed by the full spectrum of existence. The pause continues, but it is no longer a pause in the ordinary sense. It has become a way of being, a quality of consciousness that remains present whether you are in meditation or in action, whether you are alone or in relationship, whether you are facing joy or sorrow. You have become the pause itself, the conscious space within which all experience can be met with awareness, integrated with wisdom, and transformed through love. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the very wounds that once threatened to destroy us reveal themselves as the source of our deepest power. This is the emergence of what Jung called the wounded healer, that ancient archetype which lives at the intersection of suffering and service, of personal pain and collective healing. It is here, in this sacred paradox, that the soul discovers its true calling, not to transcend the wounds, but to transform them into medicine for a world that bleeds. You have traveled far from those first tentative moments when the pause felt like nothing more than a desperate grasp for survival. What began as a simple choice to breathe before reacting has evolved into something far more profound, a practice that has reorganized the very fabric of your being. The pause is no longer merely a technique. It has become a way of life, a sacred stance toward existence itself. In this emergence of the wounded healer, you begin to understand that your deepest wounds were never meant to be conquered or overcome in the traditional sense. They were meant to be inhabited, understood, and ultimately transformed into a source of wisdom that serves not only your own healing, but the healing of others who walk similar paths of suffering. The Greek myth of Chiron, the centaur who was wounded by an arrow dipped in the blood of the Hydra, speaks to this archetype. Chiron could heal others but never himself, yet it was precisely this wound that made him the greatest healer of his time. Your own wounds, those places where life has struck you most deeply, have become like Chiron's arrow, not obstacles to your growth, but the very instruments through which healing flows. The childhood rejection that once felt like a verdict on your worthlessness now allows you to recognize and tend to the rejected child in others. The betrayal that shattered your trust now enables you to sit with others in their moments of broken faith. The loss that brought you to your knees now gives you the strength to hold space for others in their grief. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor does it happen without conscious choice. It requires what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, where we consciously choose to move against our natural impulses toward self-protection and defensiveness. Where once you might have hidden your wounds in shame, you now begin to understand them as your credentials for service. Where once you might have sought to numb the pain, you now learn to transmute it into compassion. The wounded healer does not emerge from a place of having figured it all out, or having achieved some state of perpetual peace. Rather, this archetype arises from the ongoing practice of choosing consciousness in the midst of unconsciousness, choosing presence in the midst of dissociation, choosing connection in the midst of the impulse to withdraw. It is born from the countless small moments when you chose to pause rather than react, to breathe rather than strike back, to feel rather than flee. In this emergence, you begin to notice that your very presence has changed. Others are drawn to you not because you have answers to their problems, but because you have learned to be present with your own. There is something in the quality of your attention, in the depth of your listening, that creates a space where others feel safe to explore their own wounds. You have become what the Sufis call a polished mirror, not reflecting back platitudes or quick fixes, but offering the clear reflection of someone who has learned to be with what is, exactly as it is. This is not the wounded healer who rescues or fixes or takes on others' pain as their own. That is the codependent healer, the one who has not yet learned to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment. The true wounded healer maintains clear boundaries while offering deep compassion. They have learned the difference between feeling with and feeling for, between supporting and enabling, between holding space and filling space. The emergence of this archetype within you represents a fundamental shift in your relationship to suffering itself. Where once pain was something to be avoided at all costs, you now recognize it as one of life's greatest teachers. Where once you might have seen your struggles as evidence of your failure or weakness, you now understand them as the curriculum of your soul's education. This does not mean you seek out suffering or romanticize pain, but rather that you have learned to extract wisdom from whatever difficulties life presents. Jung spoke of the wounded healer as central to the individuation process because it represents the integration of opposite forces within the psyche. The capacity to hold both wound and healing, suffering and joy, despair and hope within the same consciousness without needing to collapse into one side or the other. This integration creates what he called the transcendent function, a third way that transcends the limitations of either extreme. In your daily life, this integration manifests as a new kind of presence. When someone shares their pain with you, you no longer feel the compulsive need to fix or advise or minimize. Instead, you offer what may be the rarest gift in our culture, the gift of being truly seen and heard in one's suffering. Your own familiarity with pain has taught you that sometimes the deepest healing comes not from solutions but from solidarity, not from answers but from accompaniment. You begin to understand that every human being is both wounded and healer, that we are all walking each other home through the dark valleys of existence. Your willingness to own and work with your own wounds gives others permission to do the same with theirs. Your refusal to be ashamed of your struggles creates a space where others can lay down their masks and defenses. The wounded healer archetype also carries with it a profound sense of service, not the service that comes from guilt or obligation, but the service that flows naturally from having received healing oneself. Having been lifted from the depths of your own despair, you feel called to extend that same possibility to others. Having been met in your darkness by forces greater than your ego, you become a conduit through which that same healing presence can flow to others. This service often takes unexpected forms. It may be the simple act of really listening to a colleague who is struggling. It may be the willingness to share your own story of recovery with someone who feels hopeless. It may be the capacity to remain calm and centered when others around you are panicking, providing an anchor of stability in the storm. The wounded healer serves not through grand gestures, but through the quality of presence they bring to each moment. There is also a fierce protection that comes with this archetype, a lioness-like quality that emerges when you witness others being wounded in the ways you once were. Having intimate knowledge of certain forms of suffering, you become acutely sensitive to their presence in others and feel called to intervene when possible. This is not the intervention of the rescuer, but the intervention of one who knows intimately the territory of certain kinds of pain and can offer guidance to those who are lost within it. The wounded healer understands that healing is not a destination, but an ongoing relationship with wholeness. They do not pretend to have overcome their wounds, but rather to have developed a mature relationship with them. Their wounds remain sensitive places, areas that require ongoing attention and care, but they no longer control or define their lives. Instead, they have become sources of wisdom, compassion, and connection. In Jung's understanding, the wounded healer represents one of the most essential functions of the individuated person, the capacity to transform personal suffering into collective healing. This transformation does not happen automatically. It requires the ongoing choice to remain conscious in the face of pain, to extract meaning from suffering, and to use one's wounds as bridges to understanding and serving others. As this archetype emerges within you, you may find yourself drawn to certain kinds of work or service that you never imagined before. The person who struggled with addiction may feel called to support others in recovery. The one who survived abuse may be drawn to work with trauma survivors. The one who navigated depression may find themselves naturally able to sit with others in their dark nights of the soul. But the wounded healer's service is not limited to formal helping professions. It expresses itself in the quality of friendship you offer, the kind of parent or partner you become, the way you show up in your community. It is less about what you do and more about how you are, the depth of presence you bring, the quality of compassion you embody, the willingness to be authentic about your own struggles and healing. This emergence represents a profound maturation of your relationship to your own story, where once you might have wished your wounds away, seeing them as defects or mistakes, you now recognize them as essential to who you have become, not because suffering is inherently good, but because consciousness applied to suffering transforms it into wisdom. Your scars become your credentials, your struggles become your strengths, your wounds become your gifts to the world. The wounded healer also carries a deep understanding of the mysterious nature of healing itself. Having experienced the ways that healing often comes from unexpected sources, a stranger's kindness, a moment of natural beauty, the perfect book appearing at the perfect time, you become more attuned to the subtle ways that grace moves through the world. You learn to trust the healing process even when you cannot understand or control it. This trust extends to your service to others. The wounded healer does not need to know how to heal someone. They simply need to know how to show up with presence and authenticity. They trust that healing is an intelligence that moves through relationships, through vulnerability, through the willingness to be present with what is. Their role is not to be the healer, but to be a space where healing can happen. In the emergence of this archetype, you also develop what might be called wound wisdom, an intuitive understanding of the patterns and processes of healing. You can sense where someone is in their journey, not to judge or rush them, but to meet them exactly where they are. You understand that healing has its own timing, its own rhythm, and that sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is simply bear witness to someone's struggle without trying to change or fix anything. The wounded healer knows that some wounds never fully heal in the conventional sense, and this knowledge brings not despair, but a deeper compassion. They understand that wholeness does not mean the absence of brokenness, but the integration of all parts of ourselves, broken and whole, wounded and healed, suffering and joyful. This integration creates a kind of beauty that can only come from having been broken and choosing to remain open-hearted despite the breaking. As this archetype continues to emerge within you, you may find that synchronicities increase, meaningful coincidences that seem to support your service to others. The right person appears at the right moment. The perfect words come when they are needed most. Resources manifest just when they are required. This is not magic, but the natural result of aligning your life with your deepest purpose, of allowing your wounds to become doorways through which love can flow more freely into the world. The wounded healer represents the soul's ultimate triumph over meaningless suffering, not by eliminating suffering, but by discovering how to transform it into a force for healing and service. In this transformation, you become living proof that no wound is wasted, no struggle is without purpose, no pain is beyond the reach of love's transformative power. This is the emergence of your deepest calling, your most authentic service to the world. Not despite your wounds, but because of them, you have become a source of healing in a world that desperately needs the medicine that can only be brewed from the alchemy of conscious suffering, transformed into compassionate service. As you deepen into the path of conscious healing, as the wounded healer within you continues to emerge and serve, something extraordinary begins to happen. The universe itself seems to respond to your commitment to consciousness, as if your choice to heal has activated some invisible web of connection that draws toward you exactly what you need for your continued growth. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to arise from some deeper order beyond the realm of cause and effect as we normally understand it. These are not random events or wishful thinking, but a pattern of connection that becomes increasingly evident as you align more deeply with your authentic path of healing. It is as if the very act of choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, presence over dissociation, healing over wounding, sends out a signal into the fabric of existence itself. And existence responds with an intelligence that defies rational explanation, yet reveals itself through undeniable experience. At first, these synchronicities may seem subtle, almost dismissible. A book falls off a shelf at precisely the moment you need its wisdom. A stranger offers exactly the words you needed to hear. A phone call comes from someone you were just thinking about, bearing news that changes everything. You find yourself in the right place at the right time with increasing frequency, as if guided by some benevolent force that knows your path better than your conscious mind does. But as you learn to recognize and trust these meaningful coincidences, they begin to multiply and intensify. It becomes clear that this is not merely selective attention or confirmation bias, but a genuine shift in how reality itself seems to organize around your commitment to healing and wholeness. The universe appears to have its own intelligence, its own desire to support those who choose the difficult path of consciousness over the easier path of remaining asleep. Jung understood synchronicity as an expression of what he called the unus mundus, the underlying unity of all existence. When we begin to live from a place of authentic wholeness, when we start to embody the integration of conscious and unconscious, we naturally align with this deeper order that connects all things. Our individual healing becomes part of a larger pattern of healing that moves through the cosmos itself. The synchronicities that support your healing path often arrive through relationships, the sudden appearance of mentors, teachers, healers, or companions who seem to emerge exactly when you need them most. These are not always dramatic encounters. Often they are quiet meetings that unfold with perfect timing and profound impact. The therapist whose approach resonates with your deepest needs becomes available just as you're ready to do the work. The friend who has walked a similar path appears to offer guidance and solidarity. The stranger whose story mirrors your own shares their wisdom at precisely the moment you need to hear it. Sometimes these supportive relationships come in unexpected forms. The elderly neighbor who begins sharing stories of their own healing journey. The child whose innocent question opens your heart in a new way. The animal companion who arrives to offer the unconditional love you need to risk vulnerability again. The universe seems to conspire to surround you with exactly the kind of support that your soul requires for its continued unfoldment. There are also synchronicities of resources and opportunities. The perfect workshop or retreat becomes available just as you feel ready for the next level of your healing. The financial support you need appears through unexpected channels. The living situation that supports your growth manifests just as your current arrangement reaches its natural conclusion. Doors open that you didn't even know existed, and paths appear that seem designed specifically for your unique journey. Information and insights also arrive synchronistically. You overhear a conversation that contains exactly the perspective you needed. A dream delivers a symbol that unlocks understanding you've been seeking. A piece of art or music touches you in a way that catalyzes a breakthrough. The wisdom you need seems to find you through channels you never could have predicted or controlled. These meaningful coincidences often carry an emotional quality that distinguishes them from mere chance. They arrive with a sense of rightness, of inevitability, as if they were always meant to happen. There is often a feeling of gratitude or wonder that accompanies them, a recognition that you are being cared for by forces larger than your individual will. They feel like gifts, like grace, like evidence that your commitment to healing is being supported by the very fabric of existence. Jung believed that synchronicity was more likely to occur during times of intense transformation and individuation. The very process of becoming whole seems to activate this phenomenon, as if the universe has a vested interest in supporting those who are willing to do the difficult work of psychological and spiritual integration. Your commitment to conscious healing has placed you in the stream of this transformative current, and synchronicity becomes one of the ways that current expresses itself in your life. The synchronicities that support your healing often have a teaching quality to them. They don't just provide what you want, but what you need for your growth, and sometimes these are very different things. The challenge that arrives synchronistically may be exactly what you need to develop strength you didn't know you possessed. The loss that comes may clear space for something more aligned with your authentic path. The difficult person who appears may offer exactly the mirror you need to see your own shadows more clearly. This teaching quality of synchronicity requires a deep trust in the intelligence of the healing process itself. It asks you to consider that even difficult synchronicities might be serving your highest good in ways you cannot immediately understand. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather developing the wisdom to recognize when to act and when to allow, when to push forward and when to surrender to forces greater than your individual will. As you become more attuned to synchronicity, you begin to develop what might be called synchronistic sensitivity, an ability to recognize meaningful coincidences more quickly and trust their guidance more readily. You learn to distinguish between mere wishful thinking and genuine synchronicity. True synchronicities often come with a quality of surprise, of being beyond what your ego mind could have manufactured. They frequently involve elements that you could not have predicted or controlled, yet they serve your growth in ways that feel mysteriously perfect. This sensitivity also teaches you to pay attention to the subtle currents of life in a new way. You become more aware of the timing of events, the patterns of connection, the way seemingly separate threads weave together into meaningful tapestries. You start to recognize that life is far more interconnected than our rational minds usually acknowledge, and that your individual healing journey is part of a vast web of mutual support and reciprocal influence. The synchronicities of the healing path often have a quality of reciprocity to them. As you receive support from unexpected sources, you find yourself becoming a source of support for others in equally unexpected ways. The healing you receive multiplies and flows through you to touch other lives. The wisdom you gain becomes available to those who need it. The love you experience expands to encompass others who are walking similar paths. This reciprocal quality reveals one of the deeper truths about synchronicity. It is not just about individual good fortune, but about the interconnected nature of all healing. Your commitment to your own wholeness contributes to the healing of the collective unconscious, and the healing of others supports your continued growth. The synchronicities you experience are both personal gifts and contributions to the larger web of healing that moves through human consciousness. There are also synchronicities of timing that support your healing path. Things fall into place at exactly the right moment, not a day sooner or later. The insight you need comes precisely when you're ready to receive it. The challenge you can handle arrives just as you've developed the strength to meet it. The rest you need becomes available exactly when you're approaching exhaustion. This synchronistic timing suggests that your healing process is being guided by an intelligence that knows your capacity and your needs better than your conscious mind does. Sometimes synchronicity expresses itself through what Jung called meaningful obstacles, challenges that appear to block your path but actually redirect you towards something better. The job you don't get leads to the perfect opportunity you never would have found otherwise. The relationship that ends creates space for a healthier connection. The plan that falls through opens doors you didn't even know existed. These synchronistic redirections require trust in the larger intelligence that guides your healing journey. The phenomenon of synchronicity also deepens your understanding of prayer, intention, and manifestation. As you align more fully with your authentic path of healing, your deepest needs and desires seem to be communicated to the universe in ways that transcend ordinary means of communication. It's as if your commitment to consciousness creates a kind of prayer that is answered not through supernatural intervention, but through the natural intelligence that connects all things. This doesn't mean that everything you want will simply appear, but rather that what serves your highest healing and growth will find its way to you through mysterious channels. The universe seems to distinguish between the ego's desires for comfort and control, and the soul's needs for growth and service. Synchronicity supports the latter, sometimes by providing what you need, and sometimes by withholding what would ultimately harm your development. As synchronicity becomes a regular feature of your healing path, it transforms your entire relationship to uncertainty and change. Instead of fearing the unknown, you begin to trust that whatever comes will serve your growth in some way. Instead of trying to control every outcome, you learn to align with the flow of meaningful coincidence that seems to guide your life. This doesn't make you passive, but rather teaches you the difference between effortful struggling and aligned action. The presence of synchronicity in your life also becomes a form of feedback about your alignment with your authentic path. When you're living in harmony with your deepest truth, synchronicities tend to increase. When you're off track or acting from ego rather than soul, meaningful coincidences often decrease or take on a more challenging quality. This makes synchronicity a kind of compass for navigation through the complexities of the healing journey. The experience of ongoing synchronicity gradually shifts your fundamental worldview from one of separation and scarcity to one of connection and abundance. You begin to understand that you live in a universe that is not indifferent to your growth and healing, but actively supportive of those who choose the path of consciousness. This doesn't mean life becomes easy, but it does mean that even difficulties serve a purpose in the larger pattern of your development. This shift in worldview has profound implications for how you approach challenges and setbacks in your healing journey. Instead of seeing obstacles as evidence that you're on the wrong path or that the universe is against you, you begin to look for the meaningful patterns within difficulties. How might this challenge serve your growth? What might this setback be redirecting you toward? What hidden gift might be embedded within this apparent misfortune? The phenomenon of synchronicity also reveals the inadequacy of a purely materialist understanding of reality. These meaningful coincidences point to dimensions of existence that cannot be fully explained by mechanistic cause and effect. They suggest that consciousness and matter, mind and world, are far more intimately connected than our scientific paradigm usually acknowledges. Your healing journey becomes a laboratory for exploring these deeper mysteries of existence. As synchronicity continues to unfold in your life, you may find yourself becoming a source of meaningful coincidence for others. Your presence, your words, your actions begin to arrive in other people's lives with synchronistic timing and impact. You become an agent of the same mysterious intelligence that has been supporting your own healing. This is one of the ways that individual healing contributes to collective transformation. The culmination of this chapter of your journey is the recognition that your commitment to conscious healing has aligned you with the deepest currents of existence itself. The pause that once seemed like a simple survival technique has evolved into a way of life that connects you to the underlying intelligence that moves through all things. The meaningful coincidences that support your path are not random gifts, but expressions of a universe that supports the evolution of consciousness in all its forms. In this recognition, you understand that you are not healing in isolation, but as part of a vast web of healing that encompasses all of existence. Your individual journey toward wholeness is both deeply personal and universally significant. The synchronicities that bless your path are both gifts, to be received with gratitude, and responsibilities to be carried with wisdom and service to others who are walking similar paths toward the light. Within the depths of your psyche, a profound mechanism has been stirring to life, what Jung called the transcendent function, perhaps the most mysterious and powerful capacity of the human soul. This is not a function in the mechanical sense, but rather an organic intelligence that emerges when conscious and unconscious minds begin to dance together in creative synthesis. Through your commitment to the healing choice, through your willingness to pause and remain present with whatever arises, you have activated this sleeping giant within your psychological structure. The transcendent function represents the psyche's natural capacity to create something entirely new from the tension between opposing forces. Where once you might have been torn between conflicting impulses, the desire to connect and the fear of rejection, the need for security and the call to growth, the longing for peace and the necessity of change, you now find yourself able to access a third way that honors both sides while being limited by neither. This awakening did not happen overnight. It has been building through every moment you chose to pause rather than react. Every time you held space for paradox rather than collapsing into one-sided thinking. Every instance when you resisted the ego's demand for immediate resolution and instead allowed yourself to sit in the fertile discomfort of not knowing. The transcendent function emerges from this willingness to remain present with contradiction until something new can be born from the creative tension. Jung understood this function as the bridge between conscious and unconscious minds, the capacity that allows what is hidden in the depths to inform and enrich what is known in the light. But more than this, it is the mechanism through which the psyche evolves, grows, and continuously recreates itself in response to life's challenges. It is how the soul learns to dance with complexity rather than being overwhelmed by it. In your daily life, you begin to notice this transcendent capacity expressing itself in ways both subtle and profound. When faced with a difficult decision, instead of feeling torn between limited options, you find yourself able to access creative alternatives that seemed impossible before. The either-or thinking that once trapped you in cycles of conflict gives way to both and possibilities that honor the legitimate needs of all parts of yourself. Where once you might have seen your sensitivity as weakness and tried to develop a thicker skin, or conversely, embraced your sensitivity while rejecting any need for boundaries, you now find yourself able to be both deeply feeling and appropriately protected. The transcendent function has woven these apparent opposites into a new capacity, the ability to remain open-hearted while maintaining healthy boundaries, to be vulnerable without being victimized, to care deeply without losing yourself in others' pain. This synthesis creates what Jung called a third thing, not a compromise between opposites, which usually satisfies neither side, but a genuine transcendence that includes and transforms both polarities. This third thing is always creative, always unique to your particular situation, always more than the sum of its parts. It cannot be predicted or controlled, only received with wonder and gratitude when it emerges from the depths of your being. The transcendent function also manifests in your relationship to your own emotions. Where once you might have been at war with difficult feelings, trying to suppress anger, escape sadness, or control fear, or alternatively, been overwhelmed and controlled by these emotions, you now find yourself able to develop a different relationship altogether. You can feel anger without being consumed by it, experience sadness without drowning in it, acknowledge fear without being paralyzed by it. This is not emotional numbness or detachment, but rather emotional mastery in its truest sense, the capacity to remain present and responsive to the full spectrum of feeling while not being enslaved by any particular emotion. The transcendent function allows you to honor the wisdom each emotion carries while not being limited by any single emotional perspective. You become like a skilled musician who can play all the keys of the emotional piano, creating symphonies from what once seemed like discordant noise. In your relationships, this awakened function transforms your capacity for intimacy and connection. Where once you might have oscillated between enmeshment and isolation, between giving too much and withdrawing completely, you now find yourself able to be simultaneously close and separate, connected and autonomous. The transcendent function has woven these apparent opposites into a new relational capacity, the ability to love deeply while remaining whole, to support others without losing yourself, to receive care without becoming dependent. This transformation in relational capacity often surprises those around you. They may notice that you seem more present, more able to hold space for complexity and contradiction. You no longer need others to be perfect in order to love them, nor do you need to be perfect in order to feel worthy of love. The transcendent function has dissolved the perfectionist prison that once trapped both you and your relationships in patterns of criticism, defense, and mutual disappointment. Your relationship to your own past also undergoes profound transformation through the awakening of the transcendent function, where once you might have been trapped in cycles of regret and resentment, or alternatively in patterns of denial and spiritual bypassing, you now find yourself able to hold both the pain and the gift of your history. The transcendent function allows you to acknowledge the genuine harm that was done, while also recognizing the strength and wisdom that emerged from your struggles. This is not the false forgiveness that bypasses necessary anger, nor is it the bitter resentment that keeps you chained to old wounds. Instead, it is a third way that honors the full truth of your experience, both the darkness and the light, both the wounding and the healing that have shaped who you have become. Your past becomes neither enemy nor savior, but teacher and ally in your continued growth. The transcendent function also revolutionizes your approach to life's challenges and conflicts. Where once you might have approached problems with rigid thinking, seeing only limited options, feeling trapped by circumstances, or believing that things must be one way or another, you now find yourself able to access creative solutions that seemed impossible before. The pause that you have been practicing has created space for this creative intelligence to emerge. When conflict arises, instead of immediately taking sides or trying to determine who is right and who is wrong, you find yourself naturally looking for the deeper truth that includes and transcends both positions. You become a bridge builder, a translator between opposing viewpoints, someone who can hold the tension until a new understanding emerges that serves everyone involved. This capacity extends to your relationship with your own inner conflicts as well. The parts of yourself that once seemed irreconcilably at odds, the dreamer and the realist, the rebel and the conformist, the lover and the warrior, begin to find ways to collaborate rather than compete. The transcendent function orchestrates an inner democracy where all voices are heard and valued, where the wisdom of each aspect of yourself can contribute to the whole. Jung believed that the transcendent function was particularly activated during what he called the night sea journey, those dark periods of life when old structures are breaking down and new ones have not yet emerged. Your own journey through healing, through the dissolution of old patterns and the emergence of new capacities has been such a night sea journey. The transcendent function has been your vessel through these dark waters, your means of navigation when no familiar landmarks remained visible. In this awakening, you begin to understand that creativity itself is an expression of the transcendent function. Whether through artistic endeavors, problem-solving at work, or simply finding new ways to live and love, you find yourself accessing wellsprings of creativity that were previously unavailable. Ideas emerge from depths you didn't know you possessed. Solutions appear that combine elements in ways your conscious mind never would have imagined. This creativity is not just personal, but transpersonal. It seems to emerge from a source beyond your individual psyche, as if the transcendent function connects you to what Jung called the collective unconscious, that reservoir of human wisdom and experience that transcends individual memory. Your creative expressions begin to carry archetypal power, touching universal themes that resonate with others who have never shared your particular experiences. The awakening of the transcendent function also transforms your relationship to time and change. Where once you might have been anxious about the future or regretful about the past, You now find yourself more able to inhabit the present moment fully while remaining responsive to the natural flow of change. You develop what might be called temporal flexibility, the ability to plan appropriately for the future while remaining open to unexpected developments, to learn from the past without being imprisoned by it. This temporal mastery allows you to meet life's transitions with greater grace and wisdom. You no longer resist change as inherently threatening, nor do you chase after change as inherently liberating. Instead, you develop the discernment to know when to hold steady and when to flow, when to preserve what is valuable and when to release what no longer serves. The transcendent function becomes your guide through the continuous process of death and rebirth that characterizes all authentic growth. Your awakened transcendent function also begins to perceive patterns and connections that were invisible before. You start to see how seemingly unrelated events in your life weave together into meaningful narratives. The job loss that led to the career change that brought you to the place where you met the person who became instrumental in your healing. These connections become visible as expressions of a deeper intelligence orchestrating your development. This pattern recognition extends to your understanding of others as well. You become more able to see beneath surface behaviors to the underlying needs, fears, and longings that drive them. This doesn't make you judgmental, but rather more compassionate, as you recognize the human struggles that express themselves in countless different forms. The transcendent function has given you X-ray vision into the human condition, the integration of conscious and unconscious minds that characterizes the transcendent function also manifests in your relationship to dreams, intuition, and other non-rational ways of knowing. Where once you might have dismissed these as unimportant or unreliable, or alternatively given them authority over reason and logic, you now find yourself able to value both rational and intuitive intelligence, allowing them to inform and enrich each other. Your dreams become more vivid and meaningful, offering guidance and insight that complements your conscious understanding. Your intuition becomes more refined and trustworthy, providing information that your rational mind could never access on its own. But rather than creating conflict between these ways of knowing, the transcendent function orchestrates them into a symphony of intelligence that is far greater than any single instrument playing alone. This integration also affects your approach to spirituality and meaning-making, where once you might have been torn between scientific materialism and spiritual seeking, between doubt and faith, between reason and mystery, you now find yourself able to honor both the knowable and the unknowable, the measurable and the mysterious. The transcendent function has dissolved the artificial barriers that once seemed to separate these domains of human experience. You develop what might be called mature agnosticism, not the cynical dismissal of all mystery, but the humble recognition that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any single perspective can encompass. This mature not knowing becomes a source of wonder rather than anxiety, an invitation to continued exploration rather than a reason for despair. The transcendent function also awakens new capacities for leadership and service in your life. You find yourself naturally becoming someone others turn to for guidance and support, not because you have all the answers, but because you have developed the capacity to hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. You can sit with others in their confusion and contradiction without needing to fix or resolve anything, creating space for their own transcendent function to emerge. This leadership quality is not dominating or directive, but rather facilitative and supportive. You become skilled at asking the kinds of questions that help others discover their own wisdom, at creating the conditions where new possibilities can emerge naturally. The transcendent function has taught you that the most profound solutions cannot be imposed from outside, but must arise from within the situation itself. As this remarkable capacity continues to awaken and strengthen within you, you begin to recognize that the small choice to pause and breathe that began this journey has activated one of the most profound mechanisms of human consciousness. The transcendent function represents nothing less than the soul's capacity to continuously evolve, to meet each new challenge with fresh creativity, to transform limitation into liberation through the alchemy of conscious integration. In this awakening, you understand that you have become a living bridge between worlds, between conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, human and divine. The transcendent function flowing through you is not just your personal capacity, but part of the larger evolutionary movement of consciousness itself, seeking to heal the splits and divisions that have characterized human experience for millennia. You are no longer simply healing your own wounds or solving your own problems. Through the awakening of the transcendent function, you have become an agent of the healing and transformation that the world so desperately needs. The creative synthesis emerging through your consciousness contributes to the larger work of weaving back together all that has been torn apart, of finding the third way that transcends the either-or, thinking that has trapped humanity in cycles of conflict and division. This is the magnificent gift that emerges from your commitment to the healing choice, not just personal wholeness, but the activation of capacities that serve the healing of the whole. The transcendent function awakening within you is both intimate and universal, both deeply personal and cosmically significant, both your own achievement and the universe's gift to itself through the vessel of your willing consciousness. Here, at the culmination of this sacred journey, you stand transformed. What began as a simple choice to pause before reacting has reorganized the entire architecture of your being around what Jung called the self, that deeper center of wholeness that transcends, yet includes the wounded ego. This is individuation in its fullest expression, not the absence of wounds, not the elimination of struggle, but the profound capacity to live authentically from the totality of who you are, embracing both light and shadow, joy and sorrow, strength and vulnerability as equally sacred aspects of your human wholeness. The individuated life is not a destination reached, but a way of being continuously chosen. Each day you wake into the possibility of living from this deeper center, of allowing the self rather than the wounded ego to guide your responses to whatever life presents. The small choice that once felt like desperate survival has become a natural rhythm, as essential to your being as breathing itself. The pause is no longer a technique you employ, but the very space through which wisdom moves. In this state of lived wholeness, you understand that individuation was never about becoming perfect or transcending your human condition. It was about becoming real, authentically, courageously, completely real. The masks and defenses that once protected your wounded ego have been gradually laid aside, not because you no longer need protection, but because you have discovered a protection far more profound, the shield of authenticity itself, the armor of being genuinely who you are. Your relationship to your own woundedness has undergone complete transformation. The injuries that once defined and limited you have become integrated aspects of your wholeness, not obstacles to overcome, but teachers to honor, not mistakes to regret, but experiences that have shaped your unique wisdom. You carry your scars not as badges of victimhood, but as marks of your journey toward wholeness, each one telling a story of survival, growth, and eventual transformation. This integration does not mean that your wounds no longer hurt or that you are immune to new injuries. Rather, it means that pain no longer has the power to fragment you, to split you into competing parts. to convince you that you are fundamentally broken or unworthy. When pain arises, and it will continue to arise, for such is the nature of being fully alive, you meet it as a whole person, with all your resources available, with the full depth of your accumulated wisdom and strength. The individuated life is characterized by what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. You have learned to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, independent and connected. These are no longer contradictions that tear you apart, but complementary aspects of your wholeness that enrich and balance each other. You can be fierce in your boundaries and gentle in your compassion, decisive in your actions and flexible in your responses, deeply rooted in your values and open to continued growth and change. This capacity to hold paradox extends to your relationship with others. You love deeply while maintaining your autonomy, support others without losing yourself, receive care without becoming dependent. You can be present with others' pain without taking it on as your own, offer guidance without becoming controlling, maintain your own truth while remaining open to other perspectives. The codependent patterns that once characterized your relationships have been replaced by what might be called interdependent wholeness, the capacity to be fully yourself in relationship with others who are fully themselves. Your emotional life has also been transformed through this journey toward individuation. Emotions are no longer enemies to be conquered or masters to be obeyed, but messengers to be welcomed and teachers to be honored. You feel deeply, perhaps more deeply than ever before, but your feelings no longer control your actions or determine your worth. You have become the spacious awareness within which all emotions can arise and pass away, touched by each but identified with none. This emotional maturity allows you to remain present and responsive in situations that would have overwhelmed your younger self. You can sit with others in their darkest moments without being pulled into their darkness. You can witness suffering, both your own and others, without being consumed by it. You can experience joy without the fear that it will be taken away, love without the terror of abandonment, peace without the anxiety that it won't last. The individuated life is also characterized by a profound shift in your relationship to meaning and purpose. Where once you may have searched desperately for your life purpose as something external to be found or achieved, you now understand that meaning emerges naturally from living authentically. Your purpose is not something you have, but something you are, the unique expression of consciousness that flows through your particular configuration of experiences, gifts, and limitations. This understanding liberates you from the exhausting quest to justify your existence through achievements, or to prove your worth through service. You serve not from obligation or guilt, but from the natural overflow of your wholeness. Your work in the world, whatever form it takes, becomes an expression of your authentic being rather than a performance for others' approval or a desperate attempt to feel valuable. The presence you bring to the world has been fundamentally altered through this process of individuation. Others sense something different about you, a quality of centeredness, of being at home in your own skin, of having nothing to prove and nothing to hide. This is not the confidence of the ego, which always carries an edge of defensiveness or superiority, but the quiet assurance of the self, which knows its own worth without needing to diminish others. This transformation in your presence creates what Jung called a field effect around you. People find themselves more able to be authentic in your company, more willing to drop their own masks and defenses. Your commitment to wholeness gives others permission to explore their own journey toward individuation. You become a living invitation for others to discover what it means to be genuinely themselves. Your relationship to time has also been transformed through this process. The individuated life is lived in what might be called sacred time, not the anxious rushing toward future goals or the regretful dwelling in past mistakes, but the full inhabiting of each present moment as the only place where life actually happens. You have learned to plan appropriately for the future while remaining unattached to specific outcomes, to learn from the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it. This temporal wisdom allows you to move through life with a different kind of grace. You no longer struggle against the natural rhythms of growth and rest, of expansion and contraction, of speaking and silence. You have become attuned to the deeper rhythms that govern not just your personal development, but all of life itself. You know when to act and when to wait, when to push forward and when to surrender, when to hold on and when to let go. The individuated life is also marked by what Jung called religious experience, not necessarily adherence to any particular faith, tradition, but a direct encounter with the sacred dimension of existence. Through your journey toward wholeness, you have touched something that transcends your individual identity, yet is intimately present within it. You have experienced yourself as both a unique expression of consciousness and part of the vast web of being that connects all things. This spiritual awakening does not make you religious in any conventional sense, but it does make you reverent, capable of recognizing the sacred in the ordinary, the extraordinary in the mundane. You see the divine not as something separate from life, but as the very essence of life itself, expressing itself through the infinite creativity of existence. Your own journey toward wholeness becomes part of this larger creative process, your individual healing contributing to the healing of the whole. In living from this place of wholeness, you also develop what might be called evolutionary responsibility, an understanding that your individual development serves not just your own well-being, but the evolution of consciousness itself. Every moment you choose presence over unconsciousness, wholeness over fragmentation, love over fear, you contribute to the larger movement toward healing and integration that is happening throughout human consciousness. This responsibility is not a burden but a privilege, not an obligation but an opportunity. You understand that you are part of something far greater than yourself, while simultaneously being irreplaceably unique in your contribution to that greater whole. Your particular journey toward individuation, with all its specific struggles and breakthroughs, adds something to the collective understanding of what it means to be fully human. The relationships in your individuated life reflect this transformation in countless ways. You attract and are attracted to others who are also committed to authenticity and growth. Superficial connections fall away naturally, replaced by relationships of genuine depth and mutual support. Conflict, when it arises, becomes an opportunity for greater understanding rather than a threat to connection. You can disagree without becoming disagreeable, challenge without attacking, support without enabling. Your capacity for intimacy has been revolutionized through this process. Where once intimacy may have felt threatening, too much risk of exposure, rejection, or engulfment, you now understand it as the natural sharing between whole beings. Intimacy becomes not the desperate attempt to fill emptiness through another person, but the joyful overflow of fullness shared with another who is equally full. You can be completely yourself in relationship because you know who that self is and value it deeply. Even your relationship to solitude has been transformed. Being alone is no longer a source of loneliness or anxiety, but an opportunity for communion with your deeper self. You enjoy your own company, finding in solitude not isolation, but connection to the vast silence from which all wisdom emerges. This comfort with solitude paradoxically enhances your capacity for genuine connection with others, as you no longer need them to fill any emptiness within yourself. The individuated life also brings with it a profound sense of completion that is paradoxically compatible with continued growth. You feel whole not because you have nothing left to learn or experience, but because you know yourself as fundamentally complete, regardless of what circumstances arise. This completeness provides a stable foundation from which continued expansion and development can occur without the desperate quality that once characterized your seeking. This sense of completion extends to your relationship with your own mortality. The individuated person has, in Jung's words, made friends with death, not because they seek it or welcome it prematurely, but because they have lived so fully that death loses its terror. Having discovered their essential nature as something beyond the physical body and personality, they relate to death as a natural transition rather than an ultimate threat. This friendship with mortality paradoxically enhances your capacity to live fully. Knowing that your time here is limited makes each moment more precious, each relationship more valuable, each experience more vivid. You waste less time on trivial pursuits and invest more energy in what truly matters: love, beauty, truth, service, growth, and the countless small moments that comprise a life lived with awareness and intention. Your creative capacities also reach new levels of expression in the individuated life, with the energy once bound up in internal conflicts now available for creative expression. You find yourself able to contribute to the world in ways that were previously unimaginable. This creativity may express itself through traditional artistic endeavors, but it is just as likely to manifest in the art of living itself. The creative way you approach relationships, work, challenges, and opportunities. This creativity is characterized by what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with the images, symbols, and energies that emerge from the unconscious. You become a collaborator with the deeper creative forces of existence, allowing yourself to be a channel through which new possibilities can emerge into the world. Your life itself becomes a work of art, crafted through conscious choices made in each moment. The individuated life is also marked by a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the good things that have happened, but for the totality of your experience, including the struggles and wounds that initially seemed like curses but proved to be gateways to deeper understanding and compassion. You understand now that everything that happened was necessary for you to become who you are, and you would not change any of it, even if you could. This gratitude extends to the present moment as well. You find yourself naturally appreciating the simple gifts of existence: the taste of water when you're thirsty, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sound of a loved one's laughter, the quiet satisfaction of work well done. These simple pleasures, once taken for granted, are revealed as profound miracles when met with the awareness of a whole being. Living from wholeness also means accepting the ongoing nature of the individuation process. You understand that there is no final state of completion to be achieved, no graduation from the human condition. Each day brings new opportunities to choose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over fragmentation, wholeness over woundedness. The difference is that these choices now flow from a stable center rather than desperate need. You have become what Jung called a work of art created by consciousness. Not perfect, not without flaws or struggles, but authentic, integrated, and whole. The small choice that began this journey has transformed not just your life, but your very being. You stand as proof that profound transformation is possible, that wounds can become wisdom, that the human capacity for growth and healing is virtually limitless. In this individuated life, you understand that your personal healing was never just about you. It was about contributing to the healing of the human condition itself, about demonstrating the possibility of living from wholeness in a world that so desperately needs examples of integration and authenticity. You have become a lighthouse for others who are still lost in the storms of unconscious wounding, offering proof that it is possible to find safe harbor in the self. The journey continues, but now from a place of profound strength, wisdom, and wholeness. Each day is an opportunity to live from this deeper center, to contribute to the world's healing through your own commitment to consciousness, to demonstrate through your very being that the individuated life is not only possible, but is the birthright of every human being willing to undertake the profound work of becoming who they truly are. This is your gift to yourself and to the world, the lived demonstration that healing is possible, that wholeness can be achieved, that every human being carries within them the capacity for profound transformation. In choosing to heal, in committing to consciousness, in learning to live from wholeness, you have not only transformed your own life, but have contributed to the larger healing that our world so desperately needs. The small choice has become a way of being that honors the sacred nature of human existence and the infinite potential that lies within every soul willing to undertake the journey home to themselves.